my grandpa passed away a few years ago, he gave me ownership of his cabin that he built in the 80s. He didn't live there, but he would take short trips out there with my grandma for a few days at a time. When I learned that I inherited the cabin in his will, I was excited, but also saddened at the same time. My grandparents would often babysit me for weeks at a time, because both of my parents' jobs required them to frequently travel. I'd always ask them to go to the cabin, so we ended up spending much time there together when my parents were out of town. I'm currently attending an out-of-state college, and at the time I was given the cabin, I was just starting off my first semester, so I wouldn't be able to move my stuff in until the following spring. Once that time came around, I drove back to my parents, grabbed the keys, then began moving myself in. The drive there was a trip down memory lane, but I was beyond thankful and happy that this cabin would be my first real home. It's tucked away in the woods, but the nearest city is only 10 minutes away, so it wasn't as desolated as one might expect. Once I arrived, I immediately began planning out what I need to do to get it looking nice again. The lawn was overgrown, trees and branches had fallen down, and there were weeds sticking out of every crack on the driveway. I decided to spend the rest of the night unpacking, then tackle the lawn and everything else outside the next day. It was quite a nostalgic trip walking through the rooms, as I hadn't been there in nearly a decade. To my surprise, the room I used to sleep in was exactly the same as I remembered it. My race car collection was still there, along with several toys and board games I'd keep on the shelves. I sat there in a daze for quite a while, but I eventually snapped out of it and went back out to my car. I only had a few bags to carry in, so I finished up pretty quickly. I spent the rest of the night vacuuming and dusting the inside, because it definitely needed it. By the time I was done, any energy I had was totally drained, so I decided to go outside and sit on the glider bench on the porch. To add a little context, the cabin had a wraparound porch that extends around roughly half of the exterior of the cabin. The bench faces the driveway, but past that, there's a little lake maybe 100 feet ahead. But other than that, I was pretty much surrounded by woods, so there wasn't much moonlight illuminating my yard. When I would visit my grandparents here, I'd sometimes go kayaking with my grandpa on the lake. He built a small dock just in front of the lake, which made it easier for us to get on and off, since the ground was usually very marshy. As I was looking out at the lake, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye that made me do a double take. I could make out a figure that was walking towards the dock alongside the lake. They were coming from the opposite side of it, so I watched in confusion, trying to figure out what someone was doing out there so late. My only guess was that it was a neighbor going for a night walk, or maybe a late night fisher. I watched for a while as they approached the dock, until they reached it and sat down on the edge. It really didn't strike me as anything concerning, since the cabin had been abandoned for quite some time now, so the neighbors probably didn't know I had literally just moved in. I decided to head inside and turn off the lights shining through the windows facing the lake, just to avoid any awkward interaction with the walker. Once I was inside for a few minutes, I peeked out the window to see if they were still there, but they were gone. Realizing I completely forgot to bring curtains for my room, let alone any window in the house, I started scrambling around, looking for anything that I could use that would block out the light in my room. I found a box of garbage bags under the kitchen sink, but they were white, so I had to keep looking. I eventually decided that a blanket would be my best bet, so I walked inside my grandparents' room to grab some off of their old bed. As soon as I pulled off the first blanket, I saw something strange. The sheets were oddly wrinkled from the top to the bottom in the center of the bed, almost as if someone had been laying there. The last people to use that bed were my grandparents, so I told myself that it was probably just like that from them, but something about it seemed off. It eventually slipped my mind, and I fell asleep shortly after, only to be awakened by a loud noise. My eyes shot open, wondering what could have possibly made that sound. I decided to get up and investigate, hoping that something fell over somewhere in the house. It sounded like it came from the front of the house, so I crept down the hallway to the front door to see if anything looked out of the ordinary. I peeked back through the window, but everything was pitch black. I flipped on the lights inside to try to see what would have caused the noise, but everything looked the exact same way it did before. I started getting concerned, so I grabbed my grandpa's shotgun from their room and stepped outside. Since the exterior lights of the cabin were dead, I had to use my flashlight on my phone. As I opened the door, I carefully scanned to my left and right as I stepped onto the wraparound porch. Again, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until I stumbled upon a basketball-sized hole in the porch. That was most definitely not there before, so I tensed up as I got closer. Much of the wood was rotted, and it was in much need of a renovation, so I started assuming that an animal fell through. I pointed the flashlight into the hole, and what I saw was something I never even could have considered. There, a few feet below the deck on the ground, was a large black boot. I reached down to grab it, knowing that both the hole and the boot were not there before. The boot was absolutely soaked, in addition to being caked in mud. It also had no shoestrings, which I guess explained why the boot fell off, but that was the least of my concerns. Knowing that someone was walking around my house in the middle of the night was enough to send me into panic mode. I walked back into the cabin, closed and locked the door, then called the police right away. As I waited for them to show up, I sat down by the window, where I kept looking out towards the front. Although everything was dark, I was still able to vaguely make out the dock and the lake. Right when I was finally starting to calm down, since the police were only minutes away, I, without a doubt, saw the figure of a person walking by the dock again as I looked out the window. I picked up the shotgun next to me on the floor, making sure it was loaded if I really needed to use it. When I looked out again, they were gone, and I never saw that person again. The police arrived shortly after and searched the cabin. Then they did a quick scan around the property outside. Although I told them I saw someone at the dock, they didn't do anything about it, since the person was already off my property. I'm not sure what that person was up to that night, and I guess I'll never find out. If the deck didn't give out on them, I can only imagine what would have happened. I ended up moving back into my parents' house the next night, and I haven't returned to the cabin since. Part of me wonders if that person somehow had access to the cabin, which would have explained the wrinkled bedsheets in my grandparents' room. I hope that I'm wrong, but the fact that they just showed up in the middle of the night to my cabin, which is tucked away in the woods, really makes me think they've been living there, or at least visiting. I still own the cabin to this day, but I'm not going back until I can afford to install a security system, so if this were to ever happen again, I'd at least have a chance of catching whoever it is. When I was in middle school, my parents made me join Boy Scouts, so I'd occasionally have to go away on camping trips. On this particular trip, our troop was going to a summer camp for a week, where we'd stay in log cabins. I wasn't really looking forward to it, since I wasn't good friends with any of the other kids. On the day we were scheduled to leave, my parents dropped me off in the school parking lot, where everyone would meet before piling in vans and taking off. I didn't say a single word to anyone the entire time, and I knew I was in for a long week. I found a lot of people in my troop to be annoying and immature, even though they were my peers after all. When we got to the camp, I was surprised at how big it was. Dirt roads extended miles back into the woods, with several wooden buildings and grass fields spread throughout the way. Once we made it to our cabin, we began unloading our belongings. The interior was crammed, only having 3 rooms, a kitchen, dining area, and a room with all the bunk beds. That meant I'd have absolutely zero privacy for the entire week. When the sun began to set, our scoutmaster had all of us gather in the bunk room. We all sat down on our bunks, and he explained that if any of us had to use the restroom at any point during the night, we had to bring a buddy with us, that being our bunkmates. The restroom facilities were located at the bottom of the hill our cabin was sitting on, so it was a pretty long walk for only having to use the restroom. I was unfortunately sharing a bunk with the most obnoxious kid in the entire troop, who was also known to be a persistent troublemaker. His name was Brandon, and I don't even think he knew what my name was. We never even talked before. To sum up the first night, it was hell. The cabin claimed to have AC, but it was equivalent to myself blowing warm air on my arm. Brandon was giggling the entire time with another friend he had brought onto the bunk, and I think they were playing some game on his phone that he snuck in. Hours later, his friend finally left, but Brandon came down shortly after and started nudging me to wake up. I was already awake, but I was hoping he'd bring his other friend with him to the bathroom, but I guess he decided to follow the rules for the first time ever. I got up and slipped on my boots, then followed him out the door as the entire room echoed with snoring. The air was still warm, and it felt much nicer to be outside than in that cabin. We each peed in the urinals, then walked back up the hill to go back inside. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and right at 7 a.m., I was jolted out of bed by the scoutmaster banging on a metal bowl to wake us up. We started off the day by splitting up into groups, where we'd be accompanied by a leader as we went through different stations. Some of the stations required us to tie knots, shoot arrows, or do swimming tests in a nearby lake. They were set up so that we'd be able to receive merit badges by the end of the week if we completed all the tasks. By the end of the day, I was beat and actually slept through most of the night. The following days consisted of the same general routine, and everything was moving along fine, until the fifth night. Lights out was at 10 a.m. every night, so everyone moved from the dining area into the bunk rooms. I had actually started befriending another kid named Jack. He was a bit on the quiet side, but we made some good conversation and jokes over the far from ideal living conditions. He had also struggled sleeping, and wasn't very fond of his bunkmate either. He was staying at the top of the bunk closest to the door, so he'd be ground zero every time the squeaky wooden door opened and shut. I had actually managed to catch a few hours of sleep before I was awakened by Brandon, who needed to use the restroom. Annoyed, I rolled out of bed and grabbed my boots. Once I was ready, we began walking towards the door, but I noticed that both Jack and his bunkmate weren't there. I assumed they must have been at the restroom too, so I followed Brandon as we descended down the hill. Once we reached the facility, Brandon pulled on the handle, but it was locked. It was a multiple occupancy restroom, so the door to it was never locked. We decided to walk around the backside facing the woods, since we didn't have another option. As soon as I got to the back, Brandon turned to me and put his finger up to his lip. I stopped walking and listened. I could make out an adult male talking to someone in a quiet voice, along with occasional whispers that traveled out of the ventilation window. I told Brandon we should go, but he was intrigued. Instead of walking back, he walked up to the bathroom door and began banging on it. I took a few steps back and stepped off to the side, so I wouldn't be blamed if a janitor came out that was trying to fix something inside. A few seconds passed, until the door swung open, and a grown man wearing a white t-shirt and jeans emerged, immediately pulling Brandon inside and shutting the door behind them. I couldn't believe what I saw, and I was terrified, so I ran up the hill as fast as I could to alert our scoutmaster in the cabin. I frantically made my way from bunk to bunk, but I didn't know where he was sleeping. I decided my best bet was to start shouting his name, at the price of waking everyone up. As soon as I started yelling, he popped out of a bunk accompanied by another adult. Then I led him to the restroom. I stayed way back while he pounded on the bathroom door. Again, nothing happened at first, until the door swung open. The same man was there, but this time, the scoutmaster forced his way in along with the other adult. Then the door shut behind him, leaving me standing there in the dark field alone. Maybe a minute later, the other adult in our troop came flying out of the restroom. He was sprinting and motioned me to follow as we made our way back to the cabin. Shortly after, police showed up, and the lights were flipped on inside the cabin, waking everyone up. They took attendance, making sure that everyone was there. Knowing that Brandon, Jack, and his bunkmate were in that restroom, I was sick to my stomach wondering what happened. None of the leaders spoke about the incident or told us what happened, and I didn't see the three of them for the rest of the week. I never actually found out what happened until I got back home. I didn't know at the time, but my parents were notified, so they sat me down at the kitchen table when I got home. They asked if anything happened to me, going on about how I could tell them anything without getting in trouble. I told them no, but explained what happened the night that I went to the restroom with Brandon. Unbeknownst to me, they knew the whole story, but had asked me just to make sure I was okay. It turns out, a local man had snuck onto the campgrounds, where he staked out in the restroom that night, attempting to either abduct or molest anyone that walked in. The scoutmaster was able to subdue the man, before he was able to follow through with his plans. After that trip, I never saw Jack again, but I know his parents pulled him out of scouts. My parents followed suit shortly after, but I hate to think how that easily could have been me instead of them. I've always been fascinated with nature. Ever since I can remember, something about it has always drawn me in. I spent a large majority of my childhood hiking in the woods, either with my dad or my friends from school. During the summer going into my sophomore year in high school, I was planning on trying out for the soccer team in the fall, so I found jogging in the woods to be a great way for both conditioning and my love for nature. On this day, I was doing a 4-mile run on this new trail in the woods when I stumbled across a cabin I'd never seen before. I was perplexed to see it because it was located in a remote part of the woods, far away from any roads. It was a small, rustic structure with a tin roof and faded wooden walls. The windows were boarded up, and it certainly seemed to be abandoned. I had to continue on with the run, so I reluctantly left, even though I wanted to explore it. Once I finished, I called my friend Marty as soon as I got home and told him about it. He's pretty adventurous like me, so we agreed on meeting up at the park later that day. Around 7 that evening, we met up and began hiking our way into the woods, following the trail. The cabin was only about a mile or so in, so it didn't take very long to reach it. Once we arrived, Marty was just as shocked as I was when I saw it earlier. We circled around the property, looking for any ways to get in. The front door was locked, but one of the boards over the windowsill in the backyard was not nailed in. Marty entered through the window first, and I closely followed behind. As we stepped inside, it was apparent that nobody lived there. The air was heavy and still, with a damp, musty smell that almost made it hard to breathe. We started to explore the cabin, peering into each room and corner. The interior was sparse, with only a few pieces of furniture and a fireplace that was caked in dust. We did our rounds a couple times, until we found a door in what was supposedly the master bedroom that we hadn't seen before. It was tucked behind an old wooden, dusty bookshelf. It was definitely strange, but our curiosity was high. Marty opened the door and shined the flashlight inside to reveal what looked to be a walk-in closet. Several rusted coat hangers were suspended from a wooden bar, but there weren't any clothes. Suddenly, Marty screamed right next to me, which almost sent me flying through the wall. He was brushing at his head, saying that a spider or something landed on him. When I pointed the flashlight on him, I saw that it was not a spider, but rather a pull string to an attic directly above us. Of course, being the kids we were, we decided to pull it down and climb up the ladder to investigate. I went up first, but what I saw when I reached the top completely caught me off guard. There, in a circle, maybe the size of a hula hoop, were several bones placed next to each other. I told Marty to check it out, and he reached the top of the ladder behind me. I pointed at the shadowy circle of bones, and he grabbed the flashlight out of my hands to get a closer look at them. When he crouched over them, his face turned pale. Wide-eyed, he looked at me. "Dude, these are human bones." Taking no time, we both scrambled down the ladder and ran from the cabin as fast as we could. We didn't stop until we got to my house, where we told my parents and called the police. The investigation that followed uncovered a sickening truth. The bones that were found were indeed those of humans, with some dating back to several years, and some as early as the past few months. It was ruled that there definitely was an active serial killer in the area, but the police had no idea who it was. From that day on, I never took that trail again, and completely avoided going into those woods unless I was with a friend. No further reports have been made, which is good, but the person who carried this out has still not been caught. Back when I was in my early to mid-teens, me and a bunch of my friends would regularly hang out at an old abandoned school. It was very small, only having 8 classrooms, a teacher's room, a cafeteria, 2 bathrooms, and one room that we'd never been able to get into before because it was locked, but I'll get back to that later. The school hadn't been able to keep up with the 80s modernization of our town and the large number of newcomers that followed with it, and as such, it quickly closed down in favor of new schools and buildings by the end of the 80s. Most of the place was boarded up completely, but you could enter through a window in one of the classrooms, where the board had been ripped down. Our routine was always the same. Whoever got off school first would go down to the building and go through the different rooms just to make sure that everything was empty and safe, as this area had earlier been known as the local spot for drug addicts, so used needles were a common sight for us by this point. On this one day, me and a friend of mine were first to get out of school, and as per usual, we took the walk down to the building, but upon entering, we immediately saw a large man standing on the opposite side of the hallway. The man didn't appear shocked or scared to see us, but he began approaching us. Once he was a few feet away, he asked us, "Have you guys seen Oliver?" Now, Oliver was a very good friend of ours that would frequently explore the school with us, which immediately put me on edge. We told him that we haven't seen anyone and that we just got there, to which he sighed and shrugged, then pushed past us to leave the same way we had just entered. Oliver isn't the most common name, so the chances that this guy was just looking for another random guy who just happened to have the same name as Oliver was pretty low, but none of us had ever seen this guy before, and I happen to know most of Oliver's family friends as well. When we described what the guy looked like to Oliver after this incident, he didn't seem to know who this guy could have been either, and for the next few months, we were too scared to go back. When we did return about 3 months later, it was the middle of summer vacation, and we thought it would be fun to climb up on the roof of the building and sunbathe. Upon climbing the ladder, we found the roof to be rather weak and close to caving in, but something made us take the risk, so we dared to venture out on the roof after all. As soon as we got up, we noticed a small hole in the roof, which we figured would have to be directly above the locked room we had never been in. The hole in the roof was only about the size of a football, and one of my friends came up with the idea to lower her arm down into the hole and film the room using her phone so that we could all see what the room looked like. She put her arm down, and as she was filming, she suddenly let out a blood-curdling scream and immediately retracted her arm, but her phone was no longer to be seen. She was certain that something had knocked it out from her hand, and as we looked down through the hole, we could see her phone laying on the floor. We climbed down from the roof and entered the building, now intent on doing whatever it would take to get in the room, so our friend wouldn't have to return home without a phone and have to explain to her parents what happened. About 30 minutes later, we finally managed to make a hole in the door and put our hands inside, and when we tried to use the door handle on the inside of the door now opened without any trouble. We stepped inside, and all of us stared in silence. To this day, I have no idea what this room was doing in a school building, and I sincerely hope it has never been used for what it looked like it was intended for. The room was about 4 by 4 meters, and the floor and walls were all made of solid concrete. In the left corner of the room from where we entered, there were 2 metal bowls sitting on the floor, and at the back of the room, there were 5 chains dangling from the wall. 4 of them had equal-sized cuffs, and the 5th one was rather large, almost like it could fit around someone's neck. Needless to say, we swiftly picked up my friend's phone and immediately left the place. The room had us scared, but also slightly intrigued, so after some talk back and forth that same night, we decided to go back to look at it again the following day. When we returned the next day, we found the door to be locked once again, and someone had covered the hole we made in the door with a large wooden board nailed on the door. Once again, we immediately left, and after that visit, we've never returned. I have no idea what we stumbled upon that day, but I'm certain my days hanging out in this place is what sparked my interest in abandoned places. Today, I'm an experienced member of the urban exploration community, but I've never encountered anything nearly unsettling as that. Since taking up this hobby, it has been a dream of mine to go back to that school and check if the room was still there. But unfortunately, the place no longer exists, and the area is now home to a thrift store. I am an avid and experienced urban explorer. I have visited many different abandoned sites in the past several years. This place I'm writing about has been explored several times by others since, but when I visited it, it wasn't a common knowledge location, and all the buildings were still intact except for the main house which had burned down, leaving nothing but the outer stone wall. To more recent urban explorers, it is known as the Stone Castle, and more recently, the Osler Castle, which was named by the Heritage Society that decided to fix it up. When my boyfriend discovered it, he saw it in the distance from a roof he was working on. He was able to make out 3 buildings, a large barn, a carriage house, and towards the back of the property, a stable. Right when he told me about it, we decided to make a trip out there that same weekend. From a distance, the property was absolutely stunning, sitting on the top of a hill back from the road. As we made our way up the hill, our initial opinion about the place was soon about to change. The house itself was gone except for the wall, and if you looked in the basement window, you could see an old stove laying amongst the wreckage. You could tell it had been a beautiful home at one time. Being the explorer I was, I insisted that we investigate every single corner of every single building that was on the property, and although my boyfriend was less than enthusiastic about it, I insisted, and he caved in. I honestly didn't see the point of driving for an hour just to look at the outside of the buildings. We had to go in. The first building we explored was the barn, which consisted of a main level and a lower level. Once we made it down to the basement, things went from wow to holy crap really quick. It was apparent that the basement had been used as a place for satanic sacrifices. There was satanic artwork, a knife that appeared to have blood on it, an altar with black candles, and a bottle of what smelled like blood. The most disturbing piece was an old makeshift cage with chains laying inside. My boyfriend wanted to get the heck out of there as fast as possible, but I convinced him to stay, since I still wanted to explore the rest of the buildings on the property. I told him that it was probably just a bunch of kids just screwing around, and that it wasn't that big of a deal, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Our next stop was the stables at the back of the property, and honestly, I was so caught up in my love for exploring that my boyfriend would not have been able to persuade me to leave without going into every single building no matter what. As soon as I opened the door into the stable, the smell of rotting flesh hit me. The entire room was littered with animal corpses. Dogs, cats, rabbits, even coyotes and foxes. They had all been horribly mutilated. It was absolutely the worst sight I had ever laid eyes on. We started to leave, but there was one more building I wanted to check on the way out of the stable. My boyfriend shot down my idea, saying that there was no effing way we were going there, and stomped off up the hill back to the main house, assuming I would follow. Instead, I went around the hill by myself and took a quick peek in the carriage house. The carriage house was anticlimactic. It had absolutely nothing in it. It's actually a good thing that I snuck off like I did, because if I hadn't, we wouldn't have seen them coming, and they would have been able to sneak up on us as we were coming up the hill and do God knows what to us. The first person I noticed was an adult male with a baseball bat. He actually had opened our car door and was rifling through our things, I'm guessing in an attempt to find a key. There were about 8 people in total in the group, ranging from adults I would say in their 30s to teenagers and children no more than 12 or 13. They all had weapons, golf clubs, sticks, a cane, and baseball bats. I yelled at the guy who was going through our car, and my boyfriend came charging over the hill. It appeared that we had ruined whatever plans they had in mind, because they immediately backed off, and some even tried to hide their weapons behind their backs, which was just stupid if you ask me. The guy who went through our car demanded to know what we were doing there, but we demanded to know what the hell he thought he was doing in our car, but he didn't answer, only staring at us. My boyfriend said we were just admiring the architecture of the house and that we were just leaving. Surprisingly, they let us get into our car and drive off, which in itself was a miracle, given what we had just discovered on the property. They followed us in a black pickup truck with no plates for a good 20 minutes, so instead of going home, we went to the closest police station and filed a report. My boyfriend never went back to that roofing job again. He switched job locations with one of the other employees and went to another one. I really wanted to go back, but after telling people what happened, I couldn't find anyone to go with me. My boyfriend and I continued various explorations, but we both started carrying knives. I still carry one to this day, even when I hike. I have not read or heard of anyone else having similar experiences at Osler's Castle. Recently, my cousin, who is also an explorer, contacted me with a place she wanted to check out, which just so happens to be Osler's Castle. Back when I was in high school, my friends and I loved exploring creepy places. A few of us had our driver's license, so on weekend nights, we would gather a group of 6 to 10 people and go on an adventure. One summer, our favorite place to go to was an abandoned movie theater on the west end of town. The place had closed down probably about 3 years before we started visiting it, and in that time, it had become a rundown building. There were no trespassing signs on the front entrance and at each of the fire exits around the building. The glass at the main entrance was all broken and had been boarded up. The front door was busted, so it didn't latch or lock, so people were able to get inside. We knew there had to be homeless people crashing in there, but we were young and dumb and felt invincible in a group. It was part of what made it scary. We would always wait until between 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. to go into places like this, because we didn't want anyone to see or hear us and report us to the police. We all explored it together the first 2 times we went in. The screens and seats were all torn up inside each of the maybe 8 rooms. The bathroom mirrors were broken, and there was graffiti everywhere. We were fairly sure there were people hiding in there while we were inside, even if we never saw anyone the first 2 times we went. There were a couple shopping carts from a nearby Fred Meyer inside with cans and bottles in them, and a few dirty blankets scattered around in different rooms. After getting to know the layout of the place the first couple trips, we made a game of it for the 3rd and final visit. This time, the 6 of us that went split into 3 groups of 2, and with our partner, the 2 of us would enter the front together and spend a full 5 minutes inside, while the others waited outside at our chosen exit in the back of the building. The first 2, Beck and Doug, both went in while we waited outside. About 7 minutes went by, and just as we were starting to worry that we should go in after them, they made it out the other side through the fire exit. Doug told us that they went upstairs into the office, and there was a sleeping bag that hadn't been there on the last visit, and as soon as they went up and saw it, they tried to leave immediately, but they got turned around and tried to leave through the wrong exit, which was sealed shut. They were paranoid that they were being followed out, so they just stood there watching the way they entered the theater room for a minute, making sure that they didn't hear any noises, before they finally worked up the nerve to run out of the correct exit in the room across the hallway. Doug and Beck both wanted us to all leave, but Jack and I weren't having any of that, and insisted on going in. Brad and Drew, the other group of 2 that was going to go in last, wanted to come with us, so the 4 of us went inside together, while Beck and Doug both waited by the exit. The first thing we all wanted to do when we got inside was go check out the upstairs office. Just as we started to make our way up the stairs, we all heard a loud banging sound. It was coming from the back of the theater. We all agreed it had to be Beck and Doug trying to scare us so that we'd all come out and leave, since they were pretty scared from before. By the time we got upstairs, the pounding had stopped. Once we found the office, we learned that Doug was right. There indeed was a sleeping bag rolled out on the ground, with a few paper bags set up around it. Brad flashed a light in one of them and saw a syringe, along with a few uncapped needles. We looked around up there and didn't really notice anything else interesting, but once we started making our way back down the stairs, the pounding started again. We decided we should start heading towards the exit, hoping we hadn't been caught trespassing by the police. We came out through the exit, and immediately, both Doug and Beck were talking over themselves to tell us that about a minute after we entered the theater, a really tall, creepy homeless-looking man with greasy hair walked right past them, heading for the entrance. Beck said hello as he passed, and the guy stopped and turned, then kind of lunged a few inches towards her before stopping. One side of his face was really wrinkly, so it looked like he was a burn victim or something. The guy stared them down for a second, and then, without saying anything, turned and walked around the corner where we had gone inside. They started pounding on the door right after he was out of sight, to try and warn us that there was a scary dude in there with us. We were in there for about 5 minutes with this guy, and we never saw him. He had to have heard us and hid somewhere. We started to walk back to our car in the Fred Meyer parking lot, which was parked about 100 yards away from the theater, and a car pulled into the parking lot and shined its headlights on us, before flashing its red and blues. The police officer had us all sit down in the front of the spotlight in front of his car, where he asked us what we were doing. We told him we were going to head inside the movie theater, but a really tall, creepy guy walked in, so we chickened out. He told us that it was really dangerous to go into places like this, as there had been violence in the building before, and it'd be a shame if we got hurt doing something stupid. He let us go, and as we drove off, we saw him shining a light inside the front entrance. We took the police officer's advice and never went into places like this again, although I never did find out what violence he was referring to. I've always worked delivery jobs ever since I was in my teens. When I was in high school, I delivered pizzas for 2 years, then switched over to doing Amazon deliveries until I was 24. I've never minded driving for long periods of time, and I actually kind of enjoyed it, so I ended up getting my CDL Class A license and started working as a freight truck driver in my hometown in Texas. I've been driving an 18-wheeler for a little over 6 years now, and the job has basically become my life. In the winter months, my boss puts me on the same route for the entire season, which is a 30-hour round trip to Kentucky and back. I've probably driven this route at least 20 times, so I'm extremely familiar with it. Last December, I was scheduled to depart from our terminal in Texas to Kentucky on a Monday. I left at 5 a.m. and began the 15-hour drive to Kentucky to drop off the load, then backhaul full trailer to Texas. For the first several hours, the weather was fine, but as I continued heading up north, I started to run into some poor weather. The roads in Tennessee were slick, and they had gotten quite a bit of snow in the past few hours. Once I pulled into a rest stop, I checked the weather for Kentucky, and it wasn't looking good. They were expecting snow for the entire time I'd be there, and it had been snowing there all day. Once I made it into Kentucky, the roads continued to get worse, which only extended my ETA. I ended up arriving at my destination at midnight, and once they unloaded and loaded my trailer, I started heading back. Knowing that I'd need to sleep soon, I pulled into a rest stop in the Appalachian Mountains around 1:30 a.m. for the night. I had slept there a couple times, mostly because it was pretty secluded and quiet. It wasn't fancy by any means, only having a bathroom and a couple vending machines. As I pulled in, I watched a white Honda Civic pulling out. The parking lot was completely vacant, so I got out to use the restroom before heading back into the cabin sleeping. Once I got inside the bathroom, I pushed open the first door to use the stall, but it was locked. I took a step back and quickly realized that someone was in there, as I noticed that there were 2 black boots under the door. I awkwardly gave him a sorry, then entered the stall directly next to his. He didn't reply, but I went about my business and finished up before him. On my way out, I said that I was sorry again and let out a nervous laugh, but like before, he said nothing back. I shrugged it off and walked back out to my truck, curious as to where his car was parked. My truck was the only vehicle in the lot, so I started theorizing that he was homeless and needed somewhere warm to stay. I had to get to sleep soon, because I had to be back on the road by 7 a.m. the next morning. I went into the back of my cab and rolled out my sleeping bag, then threw it on the bed and turned on the heater in the back. Since my truck was facing the rest stop bathrooms, I occasionally glanced over there to see if the guy walked out at any point while I was getting ready for bed. Even after another 10 minutes passed, the guy was still not out of the bathroom. I pretty much accepted he'd be staying there for the night, so I double-checked to make sure the doors were locked and made my way to the back of the cab, then laid down and went to sleep. I passed out quickly, but woke back up a few hours later. I don't think anything specifically caused me to wake up, since I always have difficulty sleeping on the road anyways. I had to use the bathroom again, so I zipped up my jacket and got out. Despite the freezing cold winds, I was still half asleep, but that all changed when I opened the bathroom door to get inside. The room was completely dark. As soon as I stepped in, the motion sensor lights flicked on, and I couldn't believe what I saw. The same person from earlier was still sitting in the stall. Realizing something was seriously wrong, I knocked on the door and asked if everything was okay, to which I again got no response. I pounded on the door a little louder, but like before, he didn't say anything back. So I yelled even louder, and when I didn't hear a response, I kicked the door open. What I saw on the other side was the most horrific sight of my life. Sitting on the toilet was a man with a gunshot wound to the head. His head was slumped over to the side, and his wallet was sitting in his lap. I started gagging, so I ran back out to my truck and immediately called the police. 2 highway patrol cars pulled into the lot, shortly followed by an ambulance and more police. They took down my statement and began an investigation. I was eventually cleared by my boss and the police to drive back, so I spent the next 14 hours completely in my head, replaying the events over and over. It was such an awful and sickening sight. Life went on as usual, but those images in my mind have still never left me. A couple weeks after this incident, the detective followed up with me on the case. The man in the stall was found leaving the back seat of a white Ford Explorer, along with 2 males in the front seat on the security camera. The men from the front seats were wearing hoodies, completely covering their faces. The 3 of them walked into the bathroom, but only 2 of them came out. As the car began to pull out, I was pulling in, and I unknowingly watched the killers drive away. Then, myself, completely oblivious, spent 3 hours at this rest stop with this man who was killed seconds before I arrived. The man was reported missing hours before, and the police believed that the 2 men were human traffickers. Whenever I'm at rest stops now, I'm always very cautious and alert. I wish I could unlive that night, so I wouldn't have to think about it every time I pull into a rest stop for the rest of my career. My name is John, and I'm a semi-truck driver. In this field, I spend most of my days on the road, hauling cargo from one end of the country to the other. My office is basically the cab of my truck, where I'm surrounded by the hum of the engine and the endless expanse of highway. It can be a lonely job, but there's a certain freedom in the solitude of the road. I've been on the job for over 10 years, and I have driven across almost every state in the US, delivering goods to various locations. My work involves long hours on the road, and it can be both physically and mentally demanding, but I enjoy it. I get to see different parts of the country and meet new people. It's also satisfying to know that I play a crucial role in the supply chain and help keep the economy moving. However, there was one incident that made me question if the job was ever worth the risk. It was a typical night, and I was driving on a remote stretch of highway in the middle of Arkansas. The rain was coming down in sheets all night, and the visibility was practically zero. I was navigating purely by the light of my headlights, so I really had to concentrate. I'd been on the road for over 8 hours, and was looking forward to reaching my mile marker for the night so I could pull over and get some rest. As I made my way around the bend on the highway, I nearly crashed my truck. Standing there, in the middle of the road, was a woman. Due to the poor visibility, I didn't see her until the last second, so I slammed on my brakes, almost spinning out into the woods. This jolted me awake, and I stepped out of the truck to ask her what she was doing and if she was okay. She looked extremely disheveled and seemed to be in her 20s and was wearing a nightgown. Her shoes were covered in mud, and it looked like she'd been walking alongside the road for quite some time. As she spoke, it seemed clear to me that she'd been crying. She told me that her boyfriend was driving her home when they got into a fight and he kicked her out about an hour ago, which is why she tried flagging me down when she saw me. I asked her if there was anything I could do to help, and she replied saying that she really needed a ride as she reached into her purse and grabbed a $20 bill. It felt wrong to just leave her out here by herself in the pouring rain at night, so I agreed to take her to a rest stop a few miles up the road. Once we started driving, she wouldn't say a single word, completely ignoring everything I said. She was positioned in the passenger seat with her head up against the side window, frantically typing on her phone. I started to get a bad feeling that something was off, but I was only a mile away from the rest stop, so I kept to myself and focused on getting there without any problems. Once we passed the rest stop sign, I told the girl that we were there, and she looked up from her phone for the first time and nodded her head. As soon as I flipped on my turn signal to pull in the lot, she started fumbling around in her purse. I couldn't tell what she was doing, but I kind of assumed she was trying to pay me, even though I'd already declined her offer. Before I could even park, I saw out of the corner of my eye that she had a gun pointed at my head. I stopped the truck and lifted my hands up off of the steering wheel, but before I could even say anything, she sternly said, "Drive. Try anything and you're done." I was in utter disbelief, and I couldn't even believe that this was happening. I nodded my head as I started to drive, and I merged back onto the highway. She grabbed my phone out of the cup holder and put it in her purse, then unplugged the CB radio. Although I had a million questions, I didn't say a single word, realizing one bad move could cost me my life. I'm not even sure how long we drove, because every passing second felt like an hour. At some point, she broke the silence. "You're going to get off at the next exit. Turn right and drive until I tell you to stop." I nodded my head in compliance and switched over to the far right lane to get off. Once we got off, I turned right at the intersection and began driving. Woods surrounded each side of the road, and wherever we were seemed to be very desolate. Shortly after turning down this road, she had me turn down a dirt pathway that cut through the woods. I could barely fit the truck on the road, but I didn't ask any questions and continued to comply. Soon after making the turn, I spotted several headlights up ahead. I started to feel nauseous, realizing that these people were probably with her. Once I was within feet behind the cars, she told me to stay put, emphasizing that she will shoot me if I attempted to leave. The thought of leaving certainly crossed my mind, but attempting to do a 3-point turn would be impossible, so I stayed put as she got out. There were 2 trucks parked directly in front of me, and a U-Haul truck further down the road. As the woman walked up to the trucks, 2 masked men got out, both carrying rifles, and they talked amongst themselves as I waited inside. Knowing there was a very good chance I could die, I scrambled through my options, and I came to the conclusion that I only had one. I quickly reached over to the passenger side floor, grabbed the radio, and plugged it in. I begged anyone listening for help, trying my best to give my general location, telling anyone listening to call the police. Before I waited for a response, I unplugged it and threw it back on the floor, because the woman and the 2 men began walking over to my truck. Horrified that someone saw, I tried my best to remain calm as I could given the circumstances. One guy came around to the driver's side door and ordered me out of the truck at gunpoint, so I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out. He had me sit against the wheel, while at least 3 other men came out of the trucks in front and made their way to the back of the trailer. I listened for at least a half an hour as they unloaded the trailer. I was at the mercy of at least 6 people, who all had guns, who were robbing my entire trailer in a planned-out scheme. Eventually, I was ordered to the back, where they made me climb into the trailer, locking the doors behind me. I listened as they drove away shortly after, and although I was relieved, I realized that nobody knew where I was, and I was in the middle of the woods. I started to think about my family, who would soon find out that I was missing, and there was no way I could contact anyone for help. This ended up being the longest night of my life. I was stuck inside the trailer in complete darkness for the next 7 hours. The next morning, I heard someone pull up outside, so I pounded on the side and screamed for help. A guy told me he was calling the police and assured me I'd be okay. Shortly after, the doors finally swung open, and I was greeted by a swarm of police, along with the man who reported it. When I used the radio for help the night before, several truck drivers in the area heard it and reported it to the police, but since they had no idea where I was, they couldn't do anything about it. The man who saved me, who went by RJ, was a maintenance worker for the park who spotted my semi. I can't even describe the amount of relief I felt, because I was convinced I was going to die in that trailer. As soon as I gave the police my information, I borrowed one of the officers' phones and called my wife. She was hysterical, because she was notified in the middle of the night by my boss when I missed my routine check-ins. I assured her that I was okay, and promised to come straight home when I was done with the police. Unfortunately, the group of people that planned this were never caught, and I don't think they'll ever be. I've always heard stories of truckers getting robbed, but I never thought that I'd be one of them. This experience really taught me to look at life in a different way, and I realized that it could be taken away at any second, no matter who you are. Last summer, my boyfriend and I were driving back home after visiting his parents in Southern California, along with our 3-year-old yellow lab named Gunner. We have a place in Arizona, so the drive was about 12.5 hours. We took turns driving every 3 hours, where we'd pull into a rest stop, use the restroom, then switch and get back on the road. Everything was going smoothly, until my boyfriend pulled into a rest stop around 3 in the morning. I had passed out a couple hours prior, so he shook me awake to let me know that he needed a break. I inclined the passenger seat to sit up, and I looked around for a second to get my bearings. The parking lot was empty, except for a navy blue semi-truck parked in the back up against the woods. Whenever we stop at rest stops, we always take turns using the restroom so that somebody is always watching the car at all times. My boyfriend decided to go first, so I waited inside the car as I tried to wake myself up. I was still half asleep, so I decided to open up the door and stand up to stretch my legs, just to get myself moving again. As I was leaned up against the car, I noticed that the lights inside the cab of the semi-truck flipped on, and I watched a middle-aged man with a beard get out. It didn't strike me as anything concerning, since there were always truckers sleeping in rest stops at night. I looked back down and scrolled through my phone as he began approaching the rest stop. We parked directly in front of the building, so he had to basically walk right by me to get inside. I noticed out of the corner of my eye that he seemed to be looking at me, but I tried to act like I didn't notice. Just before he was about to open the door and walk inside, he turned around and spoke to me. "Excuse me, are you familiar with different perfume brands?" It was quite an odd question that I certainly wasn't expecting to hear, so I replied, "No, not really. Why do you ask?" He went on to explain that his daughter's birthday was coming up, and he was debating between 2 perfumes to buy that he saw in a magazine. They were both brands I'd never heard of before, so I told him I didn't know, and apologized that I couldn't help him out. He said that it was no problem, then disappeared into the building right after. I decided to get back inside the car, just to avoid any other possible interaction when he came back out. Not long after I sat back down, my boyfriend came back out and grabbed the leash to take Gunner out along the grass by the woods. While he headed back towards the woods, I got out and made my way into the building. The rest stop wasn't a nice one by any means. It seemed like it was poorly maintained, having an empty vending machine and an ancient-looking water fountain in the lobby. I opened the restroom door and just about puked when I took in the stench. Everything was coated in a layer of filth, almost giving off a yellowish tint between that and the light. I hurried up and washed my hands, then splashed cold water on my face to wake up, since I was next to drive. While I was bent over on the sink, I heard the door open. I snapped my head to the side, and standing there in the doorway was the truck driver who spoke to me earlier. I screamed and told him to get out, but instead of leaving, he took another step inside as the door closed behind him. Before I could even let out another scream, he revealed a knife, then put his finger to his lip to signal me to be quiet. Once I quieted down, he opened the door back up and waved his hand for me to walk out. I had no choice but to follow his order, so I sheepishly walked past him as I scanned the parking lot for my boyfriend. When I didn't see him in the car, I got even more worried, realizing he may have already gotten to my boyfriend. The man led me outside to his truck, and as soon as I stepped out, I screamed his name at the top of my lungs. The man lunged at me, but I began running straight towards the car. Just then, my boyfriend appeared out of the tree line with Gunner, running straight towards the trucker. As soon as he saw that, he stopped going for me and retreated back to his truck, where he got inside and drove off immediately. The entire semi was unmarked, having no company name or identifiable brand. Fortunately, my boyfriend was able to get the license plate of the semi, so we called the police right away. Once they arrived and we finished talking with them, we had no choice but to get back on the road and continue our drive home. I was a mess, so my boyfriend drove us the rest of the way back. We found out shortly after the incident that the semi-truck matching the license plate we gave the police was found abandoned on the side of the road, just a half hour away from the US-Mexico border. I have no doubt in my mind that he was involved with human trafficking, and I was literally seconds away from being kidnapped. I now realize that his initial attempt to talk to me was to most likely lure me to his truck, where he would have thrown me inside and taken off. These people are monsters, and they will disguise themselves however they feel necessary to trick innocent people into trusting them. No matter how nice or polite they may seem when you meet them, they only have one plan in mind, and in this case, that was to take me. I now avoid rest stops whenever I'm traveling, and I don't ever plan on returning to one. My line of work has required me to travel for the majority of my career. I've flown over 200 times for this company, and have never had a bad experience, except for the occasional painfully long flight delay. I had a business meeting on this particular day, so I was scheduled to fly out to New York City, then return back to Nashville later that night. My flight was scheduled to leave at 6 in the morning, so I got up around 3:30 a.m. and got ready. I packed lightly, so I managed to only bring a carry-on with me for the trip. I called an Uber and got to the airport around 4:30. Once I was making my way toward the TSA line, I noticed a middle-aged man wearing a Tennessee Titans t-shirt walking behind me. Being a small-statured woman, I've always been very aware of my surroundings, especially at places like airports, since I've already had a few strange run-ins with some people. I'm never one to get randomly paranoid, but this guy was starting to creep me out. It was a week before Christmas, so the airport was packed. I was maneuvering my way in and out through the crowd the entire time, and this guy somehow managed to stick behind me for at least the last 10 minutes. As a test, I ducked into one of the bathrooms off to the side to see if he was really following me. I waited inside for a few minutes before opening the door and going back out. He wasn't standing by the door, so that pretty much confirmed that he wasn't following me. I started heading back towards the massive crowd, and as soon as I turned back down the main hallway, I spotted him standing right around the corner. I could see that he was staring at me out of my peripheral, but I ignored him and kept walking. At that point, I was really starting to panic. I'd occasionally look back every so often, and he'd be right there every time. I decided that my best bet was to go through TSA, hoping that would shake him off me. The line was extremely long, so I hopped in and tried to act normal, in the case that this was a coincidence. But of course, he was standing directly behind me in line. I was really starting to get worried, so I stepped out and walked over to one of the police officers. I pointed the guy out to the officer, who was very kind and assured me he'd take care of it. He escorted me to the front of the line so that I could get away for the time being, and he'd go have a talk with him. As soon as the officer started approaching him, he turned around and began walking away. That whole situation was really strange, and I'm glad he was leaving, but that wasn't the end. I boarded my flight and landed at JFK in New York, then Ubered straight to the meeting. Once I was finished up, I made my way to the hotel, where I had a few hours to spare before I had to be back at the airport later that night. I turned my phone on for the first time since I landed, since I'd been using the company phone for the meeting preparations. I laid down in bed and checked in with my mom and a couple of my friends. Before I knew it, it was time to go back to the airport, so I ordered my last and final Uber for the day. While I was in the car, I got a strange alert that I'd never seen before on my phone. It read, "AirTag found moving with you." I had no idea what that meant, so I looked up the alert on the internet. I briefly read an article or two, but they each mentioned how you may be getting tracked. It was certainly disturbing, but I still didn't understand what it exactly was and why it was saying I'm being tracked. I asked the driver, who was a younger male in his 20s, if he knew anything about the alert I received on my phone. Thankfully, he knew everything about them and even had one of his own. He explained how an AirTag is a tracking device made by Apple, which can be stuck onto valuable items in the case of them ever getting lost or stolen. He even showed me how he had one on his wallet, and explained that Apple's security system will sometimes glitch and send alerts to people who are in a car with someone using an AirTag. He told me I wasn't the first passenger to get that message, and assured me it was picking up the AirTag on his wallet. Learning about it made me feel old, and it's apparently quite a popular thing now. I thanked him for his help when he dropped me off, and I made my way back to the airport to catch my flight back home. When the flight landed, I made it out to the parking lot right away, which was a rarity since I didn't have to wait for my luggage like usual. Once I was driving home, the exhaustion from the day really started hitting me. I was having a hard time keeping my eyes open until I got another alert on my phone. I looked to see what it was, and as I did, my heart stopped. AirTag found moving with you. I was jolted awake, and it was clear to me that it wasn't picking up my Uber's phone anymore. I was 13.5 hours away from the driver now. I pulled over on the highway and tore through my purse, and there it was. Stuck on the inside of my outer zipper pocket on my carry-on bag was an AirTag. I was horrified and reacted by throwing it out the window and getting out of there. For the rest of the way home, my heart was beating through my chest. The alert wasn't wrong after all. The AirTag had been tracking me the entire day. Without a doubt, I know it was that guy from the airport. I can't even imagine what would have happened had I not gotten that alert or completely disregarded it. If it wasn't for that Uber driver, I most likely would have never taken it as an emergency, and I probably would have just forgotten about it. In high school, my best friend did amateur modeling, which was very popular among the girls at my school. She would usually connect with photographers through her Instagram. One day, when she was over my house, she showed me the profile of a photographer who had messaged her. It was a guy who was 10 years older than us, and when he messaged her, she assumed it was for modeling. He told her that she could model for him, but that he would much rather take her out on a date. My friend disclosed that she was 17, but he said that it wasn't a big deal to him if it wasn't to her. When she told me this, red flags went off in my mind, but she pretty much just brushed them off, saying that age wasn't a huge factor for her either, even adding that her parents had a bit of an age gap as well. Fast forward to a few months, this guy said that he had to go to Colorado for a photo shoot, and that he'd love to meet up with her sometime when he got into town. She talked to him for months, keeping me updated on how she really liked him. When I checked out his profile on Instagram, it was filled with photography, but there were barely any pictures with his face included, which was another red flag. Although I tried, my friend wouldn't change her mind on him, and as her friend, I share my opinions, but I also respect her decisions, as she's usually pretty level-headed and responsible. On a whim, I stopped by her work one night to see what she was doing later, and she mentioned that the guy was flying back today, even though he originally wasn't supposed to fly back for a few weeks. He started claiming that he had nobody to pick him up from the airport because his flight would be getting in late, so he asked if my friend could. She was a bit unsure about it, but at the same time, she was really excited to meet this guy. I guess that she decided airports were safe and that she would go get him. I knew I wasn't going to be able to sway her, and since she had been talking to him for so long, I felt a little more comfortable with the whole idea, but told her if she was going to pick him up, I wanted to be there too so she wasn't alone. She agreed, and texted him a heads up that she was bringing a friend. He did not like that idea. He told her that would be awkward and became very defensive. Then, he said that his flight was taking off and abruptly stopped responding. Over the next few hours, we sat in her room, checking that there was an actual flight from Colorado scheduled and that everything he had told her added up on paper. That's when we got a very stupid idea. We planned to go sit in the airport with disguises on and watch for him to walk out from his gate. If he looked creepy or odd, she would just text him that she couldn't pick him up, and if he looked normal, then we would just go back out to our car, take off our disguises, and walk back in. We got there very early to find the best hiding spot. There were plenty of other people sitting around, so we wedged ourselves in the back. I even asked the help desk to make sure we were at the right place. We tracked his flight on our phones, so we'd be able to see when it landed, so we were just killing time talking back and forth. I'm not a very observant person, so as I kept rambling on to my friend, I didn't notice that my friend had turned pale white. She whispered to me that the guy she'd been talking to was sitting right next to me. His flight was still 20 minutes away. There was only one seat between him and my friend, and I was sitting in it, and he knew. We casually got up and walked to the restroom. When we went back out, he was gone. His flight arrived, and nobody even resembling him got off, and he never texted my friend again. For months, I was terrified that he was going to randomly show up. In January, I went to Washington, D.C. with some very close family friends. Coming from a town of about 11,000 people, and never having been to a city even close to D.C.'s size, I was scared out of my mind that I'd be mugged or something from watching too much TV. Needless to say, I was relieved when the trip ended without any such incident. At the D.C. airport, our 6 a.m. flight was delayed 3 or 4 times due to weather. By the time we finally got to the Denver, Colorado airport, it was around midnight, preventing us from driving the rest of the way home that night as we had originally planned. I refused to pee on airplanes, unless absolutely necessary, so when we landed, I had to go. I went along with my mom's friend who had to go as well. When I came out of the stall, I noticed that a security lady was now standing beside the door. I had heard no other footsteps coming in the completely empty restroom, which was weird, because I'm always on high alert at airports. This confused me a bit, but I just smiled at her and washed my hands. Approximately 10 seconds later, a toilet flushed, but instead of my friend's mom coming out, a creepy-looking man wearing a black hoodie emerged from the stall. At the sight of the airport employee, he lowered his head and quickly walked out of the restroom. She followed him out, saying, "This is clearly marked as a women's restroom." At the time, probably mostly due to sleep deprivation, I didn't really think much of it. But the next day, it really dawned on me. A man wearing a black hoodie in a women's restroom at midnight, which was marked with an enormous sign, was definitely a weird situation. The airport was completely deserted, and I was totally alone in there with him until the security guard came in. He even managed to enter without making a single sound, because I definitely would have heard it. I didn't hear his footsteps, or any sounds like urination for that matter, so I honestly don't think he even used the restroom at all, but rather just pretended to by flushing the toilet. I never got to thank the security guard for help. I very well could have been kidnapped, murdered, assaulted, who knows. He easily could have jumped me, and I would have been completely oblivious to it all. I never really got to see what he looked like, but I just hope I don't run into him again, and that he doesn't attempt this on anyone else. When I was in high school, I played on a travel baseball team in the summers. We'd have tournaments all over the country, where we'd sometimes play up to 6 or 7 games in the span of 2 days. This particular tournament was being hosted in South Carolina, so we took a team bus down there for the weekend. Everyone on the team got along really well, since most of us have been playing together since middle school. 2 of my teammates worth noting are Corey and Liam. They weren't the smartest guys, but they were pretty big troublemakers. It wasn't uncommon for them to get in trouble with the coaches for doing stupid pranks. They were generally liked by the team, but I was always on edge being around them. Once we arrived and checked into the hotel, everyone was pretty exhausted, and we had an 8 a.m. game the next morning. We all hung out in the pool area, which was surprisingly really nice for a hotel. It had a water slide, along with both an indoor and outdoor pool, with plenty of chairs and space to hang out. Once it was 10 p.m., one of the hotel staff members told us that the pool was closing, so we got all of our stuff together to head up to our rooms. On the way up, Corey and Liam decided it would be a great idea to ding-dong ditch one of the people staying on our floor. Myself, along with a small minority of the group, were sensible enough to tell them no, but there was no stopping them. As we all walked in a group down the hall, Corey and Liam ran up to a door and began violently pounding on it several times, before they started running down the hall, where we obviously followed, not wanting to take the blame for their stupid prank. At the end of the hall, We ducked into the stairwell and peered out to see if someone came to the door. Seconds later, a man in his mid to late 40s stepped outside, and with all of our heads sticking around the corner, he clearly saw us. Instead of just giving us a well-deserved scolding, he began charging at us down the hall. We booked it down the floor, where we ran across the hall all the way to the other end, and slowly began taking the other staircase up, with hopes that we could sneak back onto the floor and get into our rooms without him seeing. Fortunately, we did, but I was still upset at the fact that we already made an enemy on the first night there, who just so happened to be staying on the same floor as us. I went to bed that night without any further issue, and got up early the next morning for the game. We were playing a triple header, and our last game was at 7 p.m., so we'd be getting back to the hotel pretty late. Once that time came, none of us were ready to go to bed yet, so we stayed in the main lobby area and hung out for a while. Everything was going fine, until Liam suggested that we should sneak into the pool, which had been closed since 10 p.m. I definitely wasn't going swimming, so I didn't say a single word as they discussed it to each other. The outcome was what I had expected, and they all agreed to go, as they stood up from the table and began heading over. I followed behind them, even though I knew it was only going to cause trouble. Once we got to the outdoor area by the pool, we were almost immediately yelled at and asked to leave by the staff. So, like the night before, we made our way up to the 3rd floor to get to our rooms. This was around the time that things started to take a bad turn. As we walked down the hallway, everyone was muttering to Corey and Liam not to do it, but despite our efforts, they pounded on the same man's door, this time kicking it really hard. Corey and Liam took off, but the rest of us were ready to tell him that it wasn't us when he came out. However, the man was carrying a pair of scissors this time, which we immediately took notice of. He screamed at us to stop, but we continued walking at a casual pace, trying to ignore him to prevent anything from escalating. We eventually made the turn down to the staircase, where Corey and Liam were sitting there, crying out of laughter. Much more serious this time, we told them to stop, explaining that the guy had scissors in his hand when he came to the door. It pretty much had the opposite effect on them, and before we even knew it, they were sprinting down the hallway again to bang on his door. I watched in painful suspense, knowing that this guy was about ready to lose it on them. As soon as they started banging on the door, it swung wide open, and the man came out, immediately tackling Liam to the ground and into the wall. Corey took off running, and Liam managed to slip out from underneath him and run away, but this guy was manic. He kept screaming that he was going to kill them as he started chasing them down the hall. We watched until he was out of sight after turning down the opposite side staircase, so we tried to run down a couple flights and check the halls to see if we could find them. We checked each floor until we reached the main level, which meant that they were either in the staircase or on this level. It didn't take long before Corey and Liam came around the corner on the other end, where they booked it to the pool area. We watched through the windows in the workout room as they ran out there, with the man following them out shortly after too. Corey and Liam stayed on the opposite side of the pool, which made it extremely difficult for the guy to catch them. All of my teammates were laughing, but I knew this was getting very serious. It was all happening so fast, and I definitely didn't want to involve myself in the situation. Suddenly, Liam slipped by the edge of the pool, landing on his knees, which allowed the guy to catch up to him. As soon as Liam saw that, he jumped into the pool to swim away from him. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it looked like Corey and Liam were trying to calm the guy down, but it was only making matters worse. Corey finally stopped running and let the man approach, who was still carrying the scissors in his hand. It looked like Corey was trying to defuse the situation, but it was too late. The guy grabbed Corey by the neck and slammed him onto the concrete, where he began stabbing him in the stomach with the scissors. We were all completely silent, and there was nothing we could do but watch. Almost instantaneously, Liam got out of the pool and attacked the man on top of Corey. Once Liam got the guy off Corey, he sprinted into the lobby and screamed to call 911. While we were all huddled around the front desk, the guy with the scissors came back, but the clerk was able to talk him out of it, informing him that the police were on their way. Once that was finally taken care of, everyone turned their attention back on Corey, who was barely conscious now. We tried to put pressure over the stab wounds to stop the bleeding, but he didn't have much time. Most of us were crying, and the entire situation was quite literally a living nightmare. The paramedics and the police finally showed up and immediately arrested the man who attacked Corey. We were all kicked out and banned from the hotel, including all of our coaches and parents that came along. Our coach decided to withdraw the team from the tournament, and we all headed home, except for Corey. The first few days after returning home were very weird. Nobody on the team talked to each other, including the parents. It wasn't until a few weeks after the incident occurred that we finally got a long group text from our coach about Corey. He said that Corey was still in the hospital, but the doctors were confident that he'd make a full recovery. Later on, I also learned about the backstory of the man that stabbed Corey. His wife had just divorced him and kicked him out of the house, so he had been temporarily living in that hotel. Any of us could have fallen victim to him, especially since we were all in a group. It just goes to show how dangerous doing stupid pranks can be, and you never know who's ready to snap. My wife and I rarely get to spend time together, as our work schedules are pretty hectic. Last summer, we each decided to set aside a week to take a vacation. We hadn't been on one since our honeymoon, so I was pretty excited for the trip. We set our eyes on Florida and booked a hotel just outside of Fort Lauderdale. The reviews that I read online were pretty decent, but I wish I would have looked further. We arrived at the hotel on a Saturday night, after Ubering from the airport. Upon pulling in, we noticed that several of the parking lot lights were out, almost making the lot pitch black. We grabbed our bags and headed towards the sliding doors at the front entrance, only to run straight into it. For some reason, they didn't open when we tried to step in, so I started knocking on the door, annoyed that we were already running into problems. Minutes passed, until the front desk worker finally came to the door and manually opened it up. It was a younger man in his 20s, who was extremely apologetic and explained that they were having electrical problems in the building that night. My wife and I told him it was okay, and he led us to the front desk to check us in. This was around the time that I really started to get annoyed. The computer that the kid was using kept powering on and off, making for a painfully long and slow check-in. Once he finally got the computer to work, he checked us in and gave us the key cards to our room. We were on the 7th floor, so we dragged our luggage to the elevator, and of course, that wasn't working either, so we had to take the stairs. By this point, I was in a really bad mood, but by the time we reached the 7th floor, I was too tired to be mad. I was ready for bed. Our room was thankfully fine, and it looked clean and well maintained. We both slept that night without any issues, and I felt a lot better the next day. We packed up for a day at the beach in the morning, and once we left our room, we were happy to see that the elevator seemed to be working again. The beach was great, except for the terrible sunburn my wife and I got. Once we finished at the beach, we made our way over to a little spot with a couple restaurants for dinner. Since it was cooling down, we decided to go for a walk along the beach before Ubering back to the hotel. By the time we got back, it was already dark, and the parking lot lights were once again not working. The door opened on its own, which was a good sign, but once again, the elevator wasn't working. We fell asleep shortly after getting in our room, until I was awakened in the middle of the night by a weird noise. It sounded like someone was moving furniture around in the room next to us, but it wouldn't stop. I looked over my shoulder to see that my wife was fumbling around with the phone on the nightstand, to which I quickly realized wasn't working. I asked her if we should go downstairs to the desk, but she shrugged her shoulders, clearly not wanting to walk down 7 flights of stairs in the middle of the night. I waited for a couple minutes to see if the sound would stop, but it never did. I decided to go over to the room and politely ask the person to try to keep it down, which I hoped would be an easy fix. That turned out to be a major misjudgment. As soon as I knocked on the door, the sound stopped, and I waited for the person to come answer. I'm honestly not sure how long I stood there, but I ended up walking back into the room when no one came to the door. My wife and I waited for any further noises coming from the room, but it was silent, so we were content. We passed out again shortly after, but what happened next still feels like some sort of weird dream to me. I woke up again to the same noise, but this time, it sounded like it was right in front of me. I rubbed my eyes and looked around the room, but I couldn't see anything. That's when I noticed that someone was crouched down at the foot of our bed. I snapped my head to the side, only to see that my wife was still sound asleep. I have no idea what I said, but I screamed, and the figure shot up in front of me, immediately pointing a gun at my head. In a low, deep voice, the man said, "Be quiet. Do not make a noise." I nodded my head in compliance as my wife woke up and inched closer to me in bed. The feeling of helplessness I felt in that situation was so overwhelming that I still feel it today. We each had no idea who he was, what he was doing there, and how he even got in there. He dropped back down to the floor and began rummaging around under our bed until he pulled out at least 2 objects. One was a small black bag, and the other one looked like a small Ziploc bag, but I couldn't see its contents. Just then, the bathroom door swung open, and another person dressed in all black emerged in the room. They also had a bag in their hand, but I couldn't see anything else. Just as quietly as they must have entered, they each walked straight out of the door, quietly shutting it behind them. My wife and I were in total shock and disbelief, and after gathering ourselves, she called the police from her cell phone. We waited for them to come as I anxiously paced around the room, looking for anything missing. Oddly enough, all of our bags we had brought were still there, and our stuff was seemingly left untouched. The police eventually arrived and knocked on our door, to which my wife and I stepped out to talk with them. We explained everything that had just happened, and the officers seemed just as perplexed as us. None of it made sense, but that started to change when one of the officers asked me which room was originally making the noise. I pointed over to the room beside ours, and they knocked on the door a few times, repeatedly saying, "Police, open up." No one came to the door, and as a last resort, the officer tried the door handle, which opened right up. They searched the entire room, only to find it completely ransacked. No one was there, but I guess that explained all the noise we had heard earlier that night. The officer stepped out, and without saying anything, they tried our door handle, and to our disbelief, it opened right up. My jaw dropped, realizing that our door opened without the key card, which explained how the people got into our room, realizing that I forgot to lock the main lock of the door. We were given a full refund for our stay, and we checked into another hotel that same night, once we were done with the police. The small amount of information the police were able to gather in this case only made it more disturbing. It was discovered that the people who broke in had just checked out of the same room we were in, just hours before we arrived. They somehow managed to check in a room under a fake name for one night, which is when the electrical problems started to occur. It was clear that they were looking for something that they left in our room, and must have gone in the wrong room when they came back to the hotel, which explains why they were in the room next to us first. Now, as to what it was they were looking for, I have no idea. It seemed like they took multiple things, which makes it even more bizarre. It couldn't have been anything good, otherwise they would have just asked the front desk to check for them. The security cameras were glitched out from the constant electrical outages in the building, so they weren't able to garner any additional information from that night. They were able to catch a blurry photo of them from the security footage of them entering, after being dropped off in an unmarked car. I'm not sure if the electricity problems were linked to them or not, but it just seemed awfully convenient for them to not work on the night they decided to break in. This was one of the most bizarre and alarming incidents I've ever lived through, and my wife and I still have so many unanswered questions. This happened in the summer, and I believe I was about 12 at the time. I was staying in a hotel in a fairly large city with my mom and my younger brother. We were visiting our extended family, but we chose not to stay in their house. My brother is younger than me by a decent amount, so I was usually responsible for keeping an eye on him. On the day we arrived, my mom put me in charge of my brother while she checked us in and received our room card. My brother and I sat down on a couch in the lobby while he played on his DS. While we were sitting, a man in his mid-40s walked into the hotel. The couch was facing the hotel doors, so I was able to get a pretty good look at him. I remember that he was very average looking, wearing a plain white t-shirt and gray jeans. As he approached the couches in the lobby, he gave me a light smile, then sat down on the couch directly opposite of ours. I didn't think anything of it at first, until I realized that he didn't go up to the counter first. He just came in and sat down. It made me feel a little uncomfortable, as I started to wonder if he followed us in. Thankfully, before I could even continue in my nervous thoughts, my mom called us over and told us that our room was ready, so we left the lobby and went up to our room. Shortly after settling in, We left the hotel to go meet with our family. We ended up staying there for most of the day, so the thought of the guy from earlier had completely slipped my mind by this point. We returned to the hotel around 7, and my mom told us that we could go swimming in the hotel pool if we wanted to as we walked past it. So, we all went to our room, changed, then went to the pool. Within only a few minutes after we got in the water, the same man from earlier walked in and sat down. This time, he was wearing the same jeans but had a sweater on, and he definitely wasn't going swimming. Again, I didn't think much of it until I noticed that my mom was starting to look visibly worried. She pointed the guy out to me, and she said that if he didn't leave within the next 5 minutes, we needed to get out and go back to our room. Well, 5 minutes passed, and he was still there, so we got our things together and left. By then, it was close to 8 p.m., and my brother and I were starting to get tired. Before leaving for the trip, my mom had rented some movies to watch, so we planned to watch one of them before bed. Even after a while, I noticed that my mom was still a little on edge because of the man from earlier, which made me a little bit more worried too. Halfway through the movie, my mom got up to take a shower, since my brother and I still had to before bed. While she was in there, someone knocked on the door and said, "Housekeeping," in a high-pitched voice. I thought it was weird that the cleaning staff would come this late, but I needed another towel, so I answered the door. I wish I hadn't been so stupid. It was the same creepy man. He gave me a smile and a little wave, and I just stood there, kind of motionless. My mind automatically went to the worst possible situations, and I started to panic. Suddenly, I heard the water in the shower turn off, followed by my mom asking me who was at the door. I was speechless, and I couldn't form a proper sentence. The man continued staring at me and made a creepy grin as he watched me clearly start to panic. Suddenly, he spoke. "How was your swim?" At that moment, my mom came out of the bathroom, pulled me away from him, then slammed the door and locked it. After asking us if we were okay, she called the front desk from our hotel phone to report the guy. I told her to just call the police, but she didn't listen, so the guy was able to walk out of the hotel without any issue. After that, we called our extended family, and they let us stay at their house for the rest of the trip. To this day, I still don't know what that man's intentions were, and it still freaks me out just thinking about it. I'm just glad that my mom heard everything from the shower, because I truly believe something terrible would have happened if she wasn't there in time. When I had just turned 29, I started hanging out with a guy I used to be friends with in high school. He always had a huge crush on me, but the feeling was never mutual. However, we'd occasionally hang out in small groups on the weekends, but nothing was ever serious. Just recently, we began talking again when he messaged me on Facebook. He was starting a clothing company and asked if I wanted to model for his women's clothing, so I agreed to meet up with him and talk about it in person. We met in a coffee shop, where he discussed my pay and work hours, and after a long conversation, I was all in. I've been working in cosmetology for the past few years, but I was eager to branch out into other fields. My modeling job would be part-time, but the pay he promised me was really good. Just through working together, we started to hang out again, and I actually started to like him. He seemed much more mature, funny, and seemed to have lost his very dark sense of humor that I always hated. After a couple months, we started dating and got a studio apartment together, where he assigned me with other tasks for the company that would increase my pay. I was really happy, but his old personality soon began to seep back in again, and I didn't like it. Whenever we had arguments, he increasingly became more and more aggressive, to the point where he was in my face telling me to hit him and see what happens. Once it got to that point, I knew it was over, so I moved out and blocked him on everything, in an attempt to distance myself as much as possible. Now that I'd left my cosmetology job to work for his business, I was applying to tons of different places. I still liked the idea of modeling, so I had reached out to several companies. One company got back to me for an interview, so I decided to give it a try. After talking with them, it seemed like a great job, and the pay was even better than my first modeling job. It was a locally run company, but it was taking off really quickly, and soon became one of the biggest ones in the area. Everything was going great, until I got a text one day from my boss to meet him after my shoot. This was something that never happened before, so I was mildly concerned as to what it was about. It turns out, my boss had gotten several anonymous complaints from other models, accusing me of doing and saying terrible things that I didn't do. I told my boss to get the names of the people because it was clearly made up. I went home that day, stressed and upset, trying to figure out who was accusing me of all these things. I had no idea, and everyone I worked with was extremely nice to my face, but it really upset me, knowing that somebody was doing all of this behind my back. Over the months, the emails and letters continued to pile in, and I began to shut myself off from everyone. It felt like everyone secretly hated me, but nobody ever showed it to me in the slightest way, nor did I ever get that vibe from anyone. It led me to a very dark point in my life, but I stuck with the job anyways, because there weren't any other good options at the time. The company was doing a nighttime shoot, so I had to work at 7 on this night. To get from my apartment to my work, it's about a 15-minute drive, mostly on the highway. When I arrived for the shoot, I saw my boss's car parked in the lot with maybe 8 or 9 different cars. At the far end of the lot, there was a black Subaru Outback parked on the far end, a good distance away from the rest of the cars. This unfortunately reminded me of my ex, because he drove the same exact car. It didn't look like anybody was inside, but I didn't give it much time, and parked on the opposite end and hurried in. Everything went fine with the shoot, and after a few hours, I was finally done for the night. When I walked outside, I noticed that the car was gone, so I pretty much just chalked it up to a coincidence. But once I pulled into the apartment parking lot, my heart sank. The same exact Subaru I saw earlier was now parked in the lot. I didn't know if I was freaking myself out or what, so I called my friend to tell her. I asked her to stay on the phone with me while I walked in, and to call the police if anything happens. I walked with a brisk pace to the front entrance, constantly looking over my shoulder at the car. The entrance to my apartment complex has double glass doors at the opening, with several bushes along the sides. As soon as I stepped under the awning to walk inside, my ex came out of the bush and attacked me, and began dragging me towards his car. I was kicking and screaming, all while my friend listened in horror. He had his arms locked around my shoulders, so my heels dragged against the ground as he pulled me. I literally thought I was going to die. My screaming was so loud that I'm sure everyone inside heard, and I didn't stop until I saw a guy come running out of the building towards us. As soon as my ex saw him, he let me go and took off in his car. The police showed up minutes later, since my friend had called them right when she heard me screaming. I gave the police his name and address, and they instantly set a warrant out for his arrest. The next day, I heard from the police that he was found inside his apartment and arrested on the spot. The whole court process was a nightmare, but he was thankfully thrown in jail for assault and attempted kidnapping. I also learned that his motivation started when he found out that I was modeling for another company. He admitted in court that he was responsible for sending the anonymous emails and letters to my work. I never in a million years thought that he was capable of such awful things, but this event confirmed it for me. I will keep his company's name anonymous for my own sake, because I can't imagine what he'd do to me if he found out one day. I live with my husband in a ranch-style house. My father, who's turning 84 next month, lives in a nursing home about 15 minutes away from us. A couple months ago, I got a call from the nursing home. It was a recorded message explaining that the nursing home had a fire in the electrical room, but everyone in the facility was evacuated safely. The message ended with a number that family members had to call to discuss proper temporary rearrangements for the residents. As soon as I heard the message, I called the number and talked to someone about the situation. They weren't sure how long the building would be shut down, but I was told that my father would be relocated to another facility just over 40 minutes away, so I was put in a difficult situation. My father has dementia, and I've always tried to visit him at least 3 to 4 times a week. He often gets confused and worried, so I always try to be there with him as much as I can to remind him that he's okay. Well, with the new temporary facility, I'd never be able to make it out there and visit him, and they didn't know how long his facility would be closed down. So I decided that it would be best to let him come and live with my husband and I, just so he wouldn't be completely thrown off in a new environment with different people. I ended up picking him up that day, and he came to live with us temporarily. He's still pretty functional and can handle taking care of himself for the most part, but he definitely needs to always have someone around. For the first week, my husband and I took turns every other day watching him, so I took off work on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of that week. I didn't really mind missing work, because it had been years since I was able to spend so much time with him. This schedule went on for weeks, and the facility was closed down for much longer than we initially expected. Everything was going great though, until I was home with him on a Friday night. My husband planned to hang out with some of his buddies after work, so I was alone with my dad for the night. We finished up watching a movie around 9:30, and after that, he was ready for bed. We had him set up in the guest bedroom directly across the hall from our room, so I'd always be able to hear him if he got up to use the restroom in the middle of the night. We said goodnight, and I kept watching TV as he disappeared down the hall and into his room. I was exhausted from the week, so it didn't take me long to head to bed shortly after as well. I passed out pretty quickly, until I was awakened by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I rolled over and looked at the door, quickly realizing that it was my dad. The hallway light was on, so I waited up and watched the door until he went back to bed. For some reason, he was taking an unusually long time, so after waiting several minutes, I got up to check on him. As soon as I opened up the door, I had to do a double take. My dad's bedroom was wide open, and I could see him laying under the covers. However, the bathroom door was closed and locked, but the lights were on inside. My dad occasionally gets confused and locks the door from the inside when he shuts it, so this really wasn't anything out of the ordinary. I made my way into the kitchen, where I had a bobby pin sitting out on the counter from when it happened earlier that week to pick the lock. Just as I started fiddling with the lock, the toilet in the bathroom flushed. It startled me, as I definitely wasn't expecting to hear that. I stopped what I was doing, realizing that my husband probably just got home, and I was already invading his privacy. I walked back to my room and waited for him to come out before I went back to sleep. Another minute passed, and I heard the faucet running for a few seconds before the door swung open. The light from inside the bathroom lit up the entire hallway until he shut it off and it was dark again. I heard his footsteps walking closer, and as soon as he walked past my door, I realized that it was not my husband. I shot up out of bed to get a better look, and what I saw completely threw me off. My dad was walking back into his room from the bathroom, but if he was in the bathroom the entire time, who was laying in his bed? I tried asking my dad if he saw anyone else, but he was already half asleep and confused, so he wasn't very coherent. Not sure if I was losing my mind, I called my husband to ask if he was home, and when he answered, the feeling in my stomach got even worse. He was still out. I told him that I could have sworn I saw my dad laying in his bed under the covers, but it didn't make sense because he was in the bathroom the whole time. He kept telling me that it was probably my imagination, and even though I wanted to believe that, I know what I saw. I felt extremely on edge, not knowing what was going on, but my husband was already on his way home by this point, so I only had to wait a few minutes. I soon heard his truck pulling into the driveway, followed by the door slamming shut. I heard him walk in, then heard his footsteps approaching as his boots hit the floor. I was relieved to see him, but before I could even say anything, he said, "Did you know the front door was wide open?" I looked at him, hoping it was a joke, but he was completely serious. The last person to use the front door was my husband, and I specifically remembered locking it on his way out. This was the point that we started taking it very seriously. We went into my dad's room and flipped on the lights, then shook him to wake him up. We asked him if he opened the front door at some point, but he said no. Although he may not have remembered, I was hoping he'd say yes, because I'm 99% sure I would have heard him if he got up and walked all the way down the hallway to the front door. I'm a light sleeper, and I've woken up every time he's used the bathroom at night since he's been living with us. My husband has a gun, so he wanted to search the house first before involving the police, just in case it was some sort of misunderstanding. I was completely against that idea, but he insisted and walked down the hallway before I could even stop him. I heard his boots as he walked around the entire first floor before opening the basement door. We have an unfinished basement, and I really hate having to go down there when I'm alone. There's only one light with a pull string that hangs from the ceiling, so the lighting for the most part is very shadowy in most parts of the room. The creepy suspensefulness of it all was enough to have me pretty worked up, and I got up to peek out the window to see if anyone was outside. As soon as I pressed my hands up against the window to look through, every suspicion I had was confirmed. The screen to the window was fully cut open. I slammed the window shut and locked it, then sat back down on the edge of the bed. A few moments later, my husband started screaming from the basement, "Call 911. Not even knowing what to say to them when they answered, I just told them that somebody broke into my house and to send the police right away. I waited for 10 torturous minutes for the police to arrive, not knowing what happened to my husband in the basement. I directed the police to the basement right away, and they had me and my dad escorted out of the house. Several more minutes passed by, and I watched from the outside, just hoping my husband would come out. Fortunately, he did, but he wasn't alone. A male who was maybe in his 30s came out in handcuffs, beaten up pretty badly. After what felt like hours, I was finally able to talk to my husband to find out what happened, and what he told me was completely unexpected. The man who broke into our house was my ex-husband, who was an extremely abusive alcoholic. He attacked my husband, but my husband was able to pin him to the ground at gunpoint, and he stayed on top of him until the police arrived. I had already filed a restraining order on him, so he was immediately taken to jail before being charged with several other crimes. After we broke up, he had sent me multiple death threats, so that's when I filed a restraining order. I'm just glad that everything turned out okay and no one got hurt, but it's still disturbing to say the least. Not only did he break in, but he chose to lay in what he thought was my bed, thinking that I was in the bathroom. Even though he'll be in jail for a long time, we've still added a home security system just in case. I'm sure many of us have had an ex that just grinds our gears, but mine is fairly more creepy than the average drunk texting jerk. About 3 years ago, I was in a long-distance relationship with a guy named Peter. He was 17 at the time, and I had just turned 19. Peter was not a nice person to say the least. He thought that the first impressions he made on people were only necessary at first, because he'd instantly stop being nice, polite, or reasonable to people after the first meeting. I was young and saw past this, thinking I could somehow change him. However, this abuse towards people, including myself, eventually became too much, and I broke off the relationship with him. The breakup went smoothly, all things considered, except he wanted me to say the final words so he could play the victim. This had been a core element of our fighting, because he hinted that he wanted the breakup, but instead of just saying it, he kept me on the hook and became even more abusive. I'm getting sidetracked, but the point is that I thought of the matter as resolved, and entered a loving relationship with my current boyfriend shortly after this. Then came the day where Peter wanted to get his belongings back. I texted him a list of everything he had left in my apartment, and he okayed that it was everything. We also made an appointment for him to stop by my apartment around 3 p.m. the following Thursday. I had no intentions of letting him back into my home, nor being alone with him for that matter, since he suddenly seemed to have many mood swings after seeing me in another relationship. He was blocked from my Facebook account, but somehow knew I was in a new relationship, which was a major red flag to me and my boyfriend. Well, Thursday came, and I felt eager to just be done with it. My boyfriend and I were walking home from our high school when my phone rang. It was Peter. He yelled at me, saying that he's been waiting at the train station for over an hour. I tried to reason with him, so we agreed to meet him there with his belongings since he needed to catch a train. My boyfriend walked with me to the train station, but we arrived only to find it vacant. I live in a small town, and the train station is mostly used during rush hour in the morning and evening. It's also located rather bizarrely among normal residences, and there are a lot of alleyways leading all over town from there. I got a text from Peter stating that he could see us, but he wouldn't come out of hiding when my boyfriend was there. We left his stuff on a bench at the train station, calmly replying that I'm not actually interested in a meeting with him. When I say calmly, I mean that my reply was calm, but I was shaking, and my boyfriend was furious over this child's play. On our way home, I received another text. This time, he stated that he had a gift for me that he left in my mailbox. This freaked us out even more, mostly because it indicated that he might be waiting in my apartment. It was entirely possible that he watched us at the train station and then ran all the way to my apartment. However, there was no trace of him, and nothing except a bill in my mailbox. By now, we figured that he was acting out of spite and proceeded to ignore the bombardment of texts, calls, and so forth that followed that day. After a while, life returned to normal. Then I got another call, this time from my ex's older brother, who was worried about Peter. Apparently, he disappeared, taking one of his brother's gas pistols. I was speechless, but since I haven't seen anything, I shook it off as another childish act. The same day, when my boyfriend was getting back home from grocery shopping, he saw police officers walking around the basement staircase on the exterior of the apartment we lived in. The next day, we were contacted by my boyfriend's mother. In the newspaper, there was a description of an unnamed young man from the same town as Peter, who had been arrested for attempted robbery of the pizza place I lived above. He was armed with a knife, gas pistol, and lighter fluid, while stating that he was not attempting a robbery, but was there to visit his ex, which of course was me. Contacting the police, I discovered that he also had a mask, fake papers, and a wig in a duffel bag, which he had thrown down into the staircase when around 4 p.m. he had jumped a fence and tried to enter the pizza place. This meant that my boyfriend went out our front door while my ex was hiding right beside the front door armed. I've never been that freaked out before. The sad truth is that my ex never got charged with anything because he was a minor and had a wealthy family. I write this now because after 3 years, I thought that this horror story was finally a closed chapter. That was, until I received a declaration of love from a fake email account signed by Peter 2 weeks ago. I've been doing DoorDash deliveries for about 6 months now. I live in a pretty rural area, so I don't make as much money as most people do. I usually go out 2 or 3 times on weekday nights when I don't have much homework, but it varies every week. I've never really felt unsafe on the job before, but that completely changed last Friday. There was a huge snowstorm earlier that day, so most of the roads were in bad condition. My truck has 4-wheel drive, and it's great in the snow, so I decided to go out since there most likely wouldn't be any other dashers. It was around 11 p.m. when I was just finishing up for the night. I got an order for a burger joint a few miles away, and the pay was decent, so I took it, planning on going home afterwards. Once I picked up the food, I confirmed that the order was picked up and pulled up the address on my phone. It was only 10 minutes away, and I didn't bother looking to see where the address exactly was. I never do. Once I was within a minute away, I checked the order notes from the customer. It said, "Hand it to me. Call me when you get here." I was still on a main road, but the GPS showed that I was only a few hundred feet away. I slowed down, realizing it was probably ordered from one of the businesses along the road. However, most of the buildings didn't have a visible address from the street, so it took me a few minutes to finally narrow it down. The building was an old mechanic shop, and it didn't look like any of the lights were on. I parked my car out front and pulled up the phone number on the app. The order name was under Audrey, so I dialed the number and waited for her to pick up. For some reason, she wasn't answering, so I texted her that I was here with the food. Even after a couple minutes, there was still no reply, and I started thinking that they gave me the wrong address. All of the lights were off inside the building, and there weren't any other cars in the parking lot. Right when I thought all hope was lost, a light flicked on inside the building. Almost simultaneously, I got a text back from Audrey, saying to pull around to the back. In my experience, I've noticed that many people like to switch things around last minute or add new information when I'm about to drop off their orders. I honestly thought nothing of it, since last-minute accommodations are part of the job. I put my car in reverse and backed out of the parking spot, where I made my way around the parking lot that connected to the back. Well, little did I know, there was another building connected to the car shop that I thought was one whole building. As I slowly drove around the side, I could make out that there was an entire warehouse behind it. The entrance doors were on the side, so I parked my car next to it and got out. I knocked on the door, expecting a quick answer, but nobody came. I waited maybe another minute before calling Audrey again. As soon as the phone started ringing, it was declined, followed by a text. She said to pull all the way around the back, and that's when I started getting sketched out. It didn't make sense why they couldn't just come to the door, but again, this was DoorDash, so running into weirdos wasn't an uncommon occurrence. I put my truck in drive and made my way down the remaining path, before turning left into the back side of the building. It looked like an old freight warehouse, judging by the several garages alongside. They were all closed, except for the very last garage at the far end of the building. As soon as I reached the front of it, it was hard to see inside. It was so dim to the point that everything looked like shadows, and I was honestly about to mark the order as delivered and take off. That was, until I saw a figure emerge around the corner inside. I rolled down the window and yelled, "Audrey?" But the response was not at all what I was expecting. It was a man's voice, who replied, "That's me. I ordered on my wife's account." I was parked maybe 15 feet away from the entrance, so I got out and trudged my way through the snow with the bag in my hand. Once I was within reaching distance, I held the bag out for him to take, but instead of grabbing it, he took a few steps back and said, "Follow me really quick. Let me get you a tip. I have some cash in the office." I told him not to worry about it, but he insisted. I waited by the garage entrance while he disappeared back into the warehouse. I was ready to go home, but I guess it was worth sticking around another minute or two for some extra cash. This entire time, I was not able to make out the face of the guy, due to the poor lighting shining behind him. Again, I waited at least 2 minutes, before yelling inside and saying not to worry about it, and that I was heading out. I got no response, and I'm glad I started walking back to my car, because as soon as I looked back, there were at least 3 people emerging out of the warehouse towards me. I threw the bag on the ground, and taking no time to wait, I sprinted towards my truck as fast as I could, slipping all over the snow. I grabbed my keys out of my pocket and pressed unlock on the key fob, just before they made it to my truck, yelling and screaming at me. I took no time to floor it out of there and call the police. I was asked to drive to the police station and talk with them, so I went straight there. I was no help to them at all, because even though I encountered all 3 of them, I had no idea what they looked like. The police searched the building and it was vacant, so there was pretty much no chance of catching them at that point. The phone they used was stolen that same night, so they used Audrey's account to lure me out there, where I'd be completely alone. I think the scariest part of all of it was that I just had my door replaced 2 months prior. The old one would get jammed and was always a pain to open. If I never had that door replaced, they most likely would have caught up to me, and I probably wouldn't be telling this story. I used to, and still occasionally do, work as a food delivery driver for my dad's Thai food restaurant. If I can remember correctly, the night I'm about to describe happened no more than a year ago, but I can't remember the exact date. The restaurant I delivered for is very popular, but only to a smaller crowd, and we'd usually get orders in the same 3 surrounding towns. It was Thursday, and the amount of deliveries on a Thursday night were always very small. I had a delivery to a house that was about 5 miles away, on this deeply wooded back road, which I had delivered to before. The road was so dark at night that when you turned your headlights off driving down it, you were blind. There was not a street light for at least a couple miles, and the house I needed to bring this food to had to be the most secluded house in the whole town. When I started driving there, the sun was about to start setting. Everything was normal. The food was in the back, and I was listening to music. The 5-mile drive was quick, but when I got there, I noticed the receipt on the bag of food read the number of a house that didn't exist on that road. The number was pretty similar to the house I had in mind, the secluded, abandoned-looking house that I delivered to before. I assumed that the phone girl must have written the wrong number at the front desk, because she did that a lot, and I knew that it had to be this house that called. As I pulled in the driveway, I noticed the sun was at the point of setting, probably 10 or so minutes until it got terrifyingly dark to be in the middle of the woods. There was still some light left, and I had the headlights on bright, so it wasn't as creepy. I took the bag of food and went to the front door. I knocked a few times and waited about a minute. Nobody came, so I knocked again and waited about 20 seconds. I decided to go to the back porch, since that's where everybody was when I delivered to them last time, and I knocked loud, but no answer. I figured that maybe I did have the wrong house after all, so I went back to the car with the food and decided to call the phone number on the receipt. I dialed it up and let it ring, but there was no answer. Then I decided to call my dad to ask him if I was at the wrong house, or if I was given the wrong phone number, because these people were obviously not home. I was the only car in the driveway. As I was looking for my dad's contact number in my phone, a blocked caller came across my screen. I answered my phone, slightly creeped out, and I put the phone up to my ear. Hello? Hi, you called me? It was clearly a man on the other line, with a very distinctive accent that definitely sounded to be foreign. I said yes. Did you order Thai food? I'm here now. As soon as I said that, they hung up. I didn't understand why the man seemed to not want his food. Confused, I called my dad, sitting in the driveway, as the sun was about to set. He told me he would call them and call me back, so I waited. He called me back almost right away, telling me that they'd be right out to get their food. So I guess after all, I was at the right house, and I had the right number. I sat in the driveway for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the customer to come out, or at least call me. A couple more minutes went by, and still no word. I decided to call the customer again, so I waited as I set the phone down on my lap on speaker. It rang for a while before it went to voicemail. I tried this a few more times, but to the same effect. By now, it was almost completely dark, and I had to get back to the restaurant for the other deliveries. Suddenly, I saw a line of light illuminate from one of the blinds in the upstairs window. They looked right at me for a few seconds before shutting the blind. I was relieved that the guy finally figured out that I was there, so I watched the door as I expected him to come out, but for some reason, he never came out. Just before I was about to throw my car in reverse and leave, I got a call again from another blocked caller. I answered it, and it was the same man with the foreign accent from before. When I asked if he wanted to come out and get his food, he replied, "I'm not home right now. Can you just set it inside so it doesn't get cold on the porch?" Since I just saw someone in the window minutes before, I said, "Could you just have whoever's inside come to the front door?" Right when I said that, the call hung up, and that was enough for me to realize that something weird was happening. I backed my car out and went back to the restaurant, immediately telling my dad what just happened. He agreed that something really seemed off, so he marked the house down in our computer to alert us not to serve them if they ever ordered again. I went about doing deliveries for the rest of the night, but that whole situation has not left my mind since. I was out doing Uber Eats a couple weeks ago on a Monday night. I live near a pretty big city, so there's always a ton of orders, allowing me to be more picky and only accept the good ones. For whatever reason, the night was going slow, and by 10 p.m., I'd only made $10 and some change. Every order's payment was too low for the amount of miles I'd have to drive, so I was just sitting in my car in the Walmart parking lot, bored out of my mind. I ended up getting a McDonald's order that was $20, quite a distance away, but I took it, mainly just to have something to do. After picking up the order, I started the GPS directions to the person's house. The GPS led me to the freeway, where I drove for 8 miles or so before getting off at an exit. The rain was coming down non-stop, making the drive on the highway especially difficult. The rain showed no sign of stopping as I kept cruising along the highway, now entering into a more rural area and getting farther away from the big city. I finally reached my exit and saw that I still had 3 more miles before I reached the customer's house. Finally, almost 10 minutes later, I turned on the customer's street. There were hardly any lights on the street, and the houses were spread far apart. I couldn't make out any addresses either. Finally, at the end of the street, my GPS announced that I had arrived at my destination. I carefully pulled into the driveway of an old, small house, with no lights on and no car in the driveway. The rain was still not letting up, so I decided I would run to the front porch and drop off the order as quick as I could. I grabbed the bag of food and sprinted towards the front door, but then I noticed a handwritten sign taped to the front door that said, "Uber Eats, please use back door." I was mainly annoyed, considering that I was already drenched from the freezing cold rain. I told myself to toughen up, drop the food off at the back of the house, and get back to my car to go home. I hurried along the path leading to the back and made my way around it. Just as I was about to set the bag of food down, the back door opened and I jumped. A man was standing there staring at me blankly. "Oh, I'm sorry, you scared me." I gave a nervous laugh as I extended the bag of food to him. I thought he would reply back, or maybe make a joke out of it, or even just acknowledge that I was there. He said nothing, only slowly reaching to grab his bag of food as he held his eyes on me. He seemed strange, and it felt like the guy was staring straight into my soul. Weirded out and freezing, I said, "Have a good night," as soon as he accepted the bag of food. I sprinted to my car, slamming the door shut behind me. I was completely soaked. Before I could even start my car, I noticed the front porch light turn on, followed by the same man stepping outside. He pulled out an umbrella and started walking towards my car with the bag I had just dropped off in his hand. I cracked my window as he walked up, and he said, "The quarter pounder I ordered is missing." I asked him if I could see the bag, because I was almost certain that it was in there before. He kind of hesitated for a second and almost started acting nervous. He held the bag out, and I cracked my window just enough so that I could grab it. I turned on my car light and checked inside. Everything was there. To confirm this, I compared his order with what was in the bag, and everything was 100% correct. He nervously laughed and said something like, "Whoops, guess I didn't see that." I told him it was fine, and as soon as he took it, I started rolling up the window. And I'm glad I did, because as soon as it started going up, the guy pulled out a can of pepper spray and tried to spray it through the crack. I screamed, as it totally took me by shock, and backed out of there as fast as I could. Luckily, it wasn't a direct hit, but some of the spray got in my car. My left eye was completely burning and teared up, but my right eye didn't get it as bad, so I was still able to drive. I called the police and explained everything that happened. When they arrived, the same man was inside his house and arrested. I now have a restraining order on him to hopefully prevent this from happening again in the future when he gets out, but I'm terrified of what could happen to me or someone else once he's freed again. I moved into my first ever house 4 months ago. My dad owns several real estate properties in the area, so he's been letting me rent it out ever since I turned 18. It's a small, one-story house that sits on a side road just off of a busy street. The surrounding houses are pretty close to each other, but most of the backyards are decently sized. Ever since I moved in, I haven't really met or talked with any of the neighbors. It seemed like most people kept to themselves, which is something I'm totally fine with. Everything seemed perfectly normal for the first couple months, until I got home from work on a late Wednesday night. It had been snowing heavily for the entire day, so unfortunately, I had to go out and shovel the driveway. I was exhausted, but I couldn't rely on my siblings to take care of it like I used to. I'm the only girl among 3 older brothers, so I've usually just guilted them into doing it for me. Now that I was on my own, I bundled up and made my way back outside as soon as I got home. I let my 5-year-old poodle, Duke, out of his cage so that he could go outside with me while I shoveled the snow. Duke's favorite thing in the entire world is snow, and I could tell he was excited as soon as he stepped outside. He has a shock collar that keeps him in his boundaries, so I never have to worry about him when he's out. While I was outside clearing off the driveway, my neighbor from across the street, who I hadn't met yet, came outside with his snowblower. He noticed me right away and started walking over. I stopped what I was doing and said hi, as he held out his hand and introduced himself as Rob. He was bald, skinny, and wore a gray newsboy hat. "Would you like me to help you out with the driveway?" I said no thanks, but he ignored my response and brought his snowblower over. It was a very kind gesture, and I thanked him as I got back to shoveling. Once we finished, he offered to make me tea or coffee, but I politely declined and walked back inside after thanking him again. He definitely seemed nice, but something about him seemed to be missing. His actions were endearing, but his personality felt like it didn't line up. He showed little emotion, but would make odd jokes and laugh at weird times. I guess I just chalked it up to him being a little awkward, because after all, he did just help me with the entire driveway. I went back inside with Duke and showered, then lay down on the couch to watch Netflix before bed. Once I was about to pass out, I let Duke outside one more time to do his business. The snow was continuing to fall heavily, and the icy wind was whipping around, making it feel way colder than it really was. I noticed that Rob's entire house was completely dark, having no lamppost or spotlights to light up his property at night. His garage door was now closed, but I could see a dim light shining through the small garage windows in the center. I was still getting to know everyone on the street, so it didn't really strike me as anything strange. I went back to my room and fell asleep, before I was awakened to a loud noise coming from outside my house. I wiped the sleep out of my eyes and grabbed my phone, checking to see what time it was. It was 2 a.m. I sat up in bed and leaned over to peek through the window curtain. I couldn't believe it. Rob was outside plowing my driveway again. His garage was open, and the light from inside illuminated a good portion of my driveway. It was way too late to be doing such a deed, so I slipped on my shoes and walked outside to the front porch. I tried waving at him whenever he'd be facing my direction, but it was like he didn't even see me standing there with my front porch light on too. I walked down the driveway and kept trying to get his attention, but he basically acted like I wasn't even there. Once I was within feet of him, he finally stopped what he was doing and looked up at me. He had a confused look on his face and acted surprised when I said, "Do you mind stopping? It's too late and people are trying to sleep." He looked at me like I had just verbally abused him and replied, "Oh, okay, you're welcome anyways." As to why he was getting mad, I don't know. I felt like I had the right to be at the very least annoyed, but I stayed composed and thanked him in a kind tone anyways. He kept the same blank expression on his face, and after uncomfortably staring at me for a couple seconds, he turned and walked his snowblower back. I walked back inside, and as soon as I began to shut my door, I saw him walking back down the driveway, this time with the shovel in his hand. I stepped back outside and asked him if he minded not doing anything else tonight, but his response genuinely freaked me out. He stopped in his track and stared at me, before saying, "You'll wish you hadn't said that." Hearing that left me speechless, and I stepped back in before closing and locking the door. Duke was standing at the screen door the whole time barking, definitely sensing that something was wrong. Instead of having him sleep in his dog bed in the living room, I brought him into my room to sleep with me for the night. Before laying down, I looked out the window one more time, and he was gone. The garage was closed, the lights were off, and the house went back to looking like a blank sheet of darkness. As I was on my phone, trying to get comfortable before I slept, I got a call from an unknown number. It instantly creeped me out, and I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Seconds later, I got a voicemail notification. I put the phone up to my ear and only heard static before it was interrupted by the sound of breathing. The voicemail was only 10 seconds, and the person on the other line never spoke a single word. It all lined up too closely together for it to be a coincidence that some random person called me in the middle of the night, and I instantly thought back to Rob. After a sleepless night, my paranoia was at an all-time high. The entire night, the wind continued to whirl around the house, making creaking noises that only added to my worries. The next morning, I was beyond tired, but I still had to go into work. As I was taking the trash out before I left, I noticed a track of footsteps on the side of the house that were definitely not mine. That horrible feeling I had the night before came back, and I was able to follow them since they still looked somewhat fresh. The footsteps looped around to the back of the house, where they led up the deck, to the back door, and back down, before leading to every door and window of my house. Without a doubt in my mind, I knew it was him. I ran back inside and called my dad, telling him everything that happened. He came right after and helped me load up all of my belongings, and I moved back home that very day. We considered calling the police, but we decided it would be best not to, especially since I was moving out anyway. We didn't want to upset the wrong person, which in this case was my psycho neighbor, and I was perfectly fine with leaving and never coming back. My husband and I have lived in the same house for over a decade now. We specifically moved into this area because of two main reasons. One, it's safe, and two, it has an excellent school system. My daughter Lily, who's 7, loves to play outside with some of the kids in the neighborhood. She has a neighborhood friend group of about 4 or 5, and they're all very nice kids, including their parents. An old couple lives right across the street from us, and my husband and I like to refer to them as the neighborhood vigilantes. They're always the first to find out the inside scoop, whether it's with the neighbors, the city, or just about anything that has to do with general neighborhood gossip. Don't get me wrong, they're very nice people, but I seriously don't know how they find out the stuff they do. Anyway, our neighbors directly next to us had moved out, but we still hadn't met or heard anything about the new neighbors that moved in the week prior. I was out in the front yard one night kicking a soccer ball around with Lily when the old lady from across the street was just getting home. Lily and I gave her a wave, and she walked over to our yard. This wasn't an uncommon thing, and we'd occasionally chat whenever we saw each other. Since I was obviously curious, I started asking her if she heard anything about the new neighbors. She told us that it was a single man in his late 60s named Chester, who was a retired teacher. Other than that, she didn't really know much about him. None of us had really seen him, other than the first day he moved in, when he was bringing in boxes. We agreed to text each other updates if we ever met or talked with him. Well, weeks passed, and it seemed like nobody in the neighborhood had seen this guy. On this particular night, Lily was out in the front yard playing with 2 of her friends, and the sun was just about to set. Once it was time to send everybody home, I stepped outside and told them they had to wrap it up. The 2 girls each left, and I went back inside with Lily. I asked her how her night was, and what she told me was deeply disturbing. She told me that she met the new neighbor, who apparently came outside earlier in the day when they were walking by his house to get to her friend's house. She explained how the guy stepped outside, walked down the driveway, then asked the girls if they wanted to come inside for lemonade. Thankfully, they were all smart enough to say no and walk away, but this really gave me a sickening feeling inside. I texted the lady across the street letting her know that there was a problem, and she was soon filled in on the issue. When I had Lily tell my husband what she told me, he was furious. He stormed out of the front door and walked over to his house and pounded on his door, while I told Lily to stay inside and followed him over. The lights in his house were on, and his car was in the driveway, but he wasn't coming to the door. He was definitely home. If this was someone we knew well and trusted, we obviously wouldn't have reacted this way, but since neither of us hadn't even met him, he was crossing a serious boundary. The word soon got around the neighborhood, and I ended up meeting with the parents of Lily's neighborhood friends. We agreed to all be extremely vigilant of that man, especially when our daughters were outside. Well, not too long after that initial encounter, something else happened. I was in the kitchen one night while Lily was over her friend's house when I got a call from the parents. "Hey, you need to come over right now. Everyone's fine, but we need to talk about something." Worried, I got in my car and sped a few houses down before pulling into their driveway. When I got there, the parents were standing at the door. I anxiously walked up the driveway, and they invited me inside. The girls were in the basement, and they asked me to sit down on the couch in their living room. That's when the mother spoke up. She said that the girls were playing in the front, and she'd been out there the whole night with them. When she got up to go inside for a few minutes to prepare dinner, the man came walking by with the dog, and he let the girls pet it. The mother, still having no idea, came back outside a few minutes later to see that the man was just inches away from Lily, taking a picture of her and his dog. She quickly told her husband, and they confronted the man, who was surprisingly confrontational, denying he ever did it and acting like he did nothing wrong. They told the man to leave and brought the girls inside just before calling me. As soon as I got back home, I called my husband, who was working late. We were able to file a restraining order on Chester, but unfortunately, that was all we could do. It doesn't really make a difference when they live next door, and we certainly didn't feel any safer. Although we don't want to leave our home, my husband and I have agreed that we have to move. Since that night, I've caught him looking out the window multiple times while walking Lily to the bus stop in the mornings. It's not safe for her anymore, and if he's already been this aggressive and obvious about his interest with little girls, he's not going to stop. I live in a suburban neighborhood surrounding a very affluent city. Many of the people who live in my neighborhood are either big business workers, engineers, or medical professionals. I was about 15 at the time the craziness started happening, and my younger brother was still in middle school. I live on a small cul-de-sac with other families who had kids that were around my age. Directly across the street lived a man. His name was Bass, and he lived with his wife and young daughter. Bass was an engineer for a local company, and he was very friendly for the first year he lived across from us. We even invited him and his family to our cookouts and neighborhood gatherings, because at the time, he seemed like a normal guy. Somewhere along the line, people on our street began to see strange things happening at Bass's house. The lawn was never cut, the pool wasn't cleaned, and his wife and daughter would occasionally leave the house for long periods at a time. We would all see Bass drive off in his sports car, but his family was rarely with him. It turns out, Bass had some sort of mental break, and he threatened his wife with a gun while he was intoxicated. When issues like that arose, his wife and daughter would immediately get out of there. During a freezing cold winter night, I woke up to the sounds of police cars, fire trucks, and ambulances. Considering I live in a small neighborhood, I rarely see any emergency vehicles in our area, maybe the occasional cop for a noise complaint from our older neighbors, but that was it. It happened around 2 in the morning, so I groggily got up and went to my window to see what was going on. My heart immediately sank. Bass had gotten drunk again, and purposely buried himself in a snowbank naked, and refused help from authorities. We all felt bad for Bass, because he was such a nice man when we met him, but somewhere along the way, it seemed like he just snapped. Fast forward to that following summer, Bass's drinking problem had gotten way out of hand, to the point where he lost his job and license due to multiple DWIs. I was home alone, babysitting my brother and the next door neighbor, because both of our parents worked, and my brother was good friends with the neighbor's kid. Around lunchtime, a cop pulled up to our house, saying that Bass had taken a car, drove it around the neighborhood at alarmingly fast speeds, and was possibly armed. He was arrested for owning unregistered weapons prior. Apparently, he heard that the cops were coming because so many of our neighbors complained, so he ditched the car and was last seen wandering through the woods behind my house and the neighboring houses on my side of the road. You know that feeling when you reach in your pocket to find something and it's not there? That stomach-dropping sensation? I had that times 1,000. The cop told me to call them immediately if I saw him go back to his house, so it sounded like he completely got away from them. After the cop left, I went into panic mode. I locked all the windows and doors, and informed my brother and the neighbor to call the parents and fill them in on the situation, since they were still at work. An hour passed, and my brother and his friend were just sitting in the living room watching TV, and I was in the dining room so I could keep looking out the window. At some point, I noticed that the trees along the side of my yard were moving, almost as if someone was trying to push through them. I immediately told my brother and the neighbor to get away from the windows and stay quiet. As soon as I said that, I saw Bass stick his head out of the trees, spot me in the window, and run back into the woods. I immediately called the cops, freaking out, telling them that he was still hiding in the woods in my backyard. Bass knew what my parents' car looked like, and since they weren't in the driveway, he most likely knew that I was home alone. I was relieved that he was at least back in the woods again, but knowing he was still close was unsettling. For the hour following my call to the cops, there was no sign of Bass, until he appeared in my backyard walking out of the woods. I was freaking out again, because the only thing between me and Bass was a sliding glass door. I was in the kitchen, so I ducked behind a countertop. I eventually peeked my head up after a minute, and saw that he was just looking at my door from about 20 feet away, just staring and not moving. After about 10 minutes, he ran to the front yard, and that's when I noticed that he had something in his pocket. I wasn't exactly sure what it was, but he kept his hand close to it while going into the road and locking himself back into his garage. The cops came, but since he was back on his property, and they had no evidence other than the neighbor's account of him driving through the neighborhood, they really couldn't do anything, except give him a warning. It was his word against the neighbors at that point. Years went on, and he continued to become more and more psychotic. He would often lock himself in the garage, where he had stocked up large propane tanks, and had planned to light a match, which would have completely blown the place up. Luckily, the next-door neighbors smelled the gas, and they called the cops and the fire department immediately. They went in wearing full hazmat suits and were able to retrieve him from the garage. During my junior year, he ended up just randomly disappearing. Rumors started spreading around, where some people thought he was either in a mental asylum, jail, or with his mother who came to take him out of state. The house is still empty to this day, and it honestly looks really creepy. Nobody really knows what happened to him. I still live there today, but I definitely sleep better knowing that Bass isn't there anymore. This happened about 4 years ago. To give some backstory, I'm from Australia, and I lived there during this event at the time. My girlfriend, who's now my wife, lived in another country, but was visiting me over Christmas break. I lived in a big city, which if you drove for about an hour in any direction, you would either be led to another city or to beautiful areas of nature. My friends and I decided to take my girlfriend to see the mountainous nature, and we decided on a national park about an hour and a half away from where we lived. This place was definitely no sort of secret location. It's very well known, but there are a ton of different areas to it, all with different rural and windy roads taking you to the various areas of the park. We traveled in 2 different cars, with my friends in one and me and my girlfriend in another. Once we were finished hiking for the day, we headed home down one of the less common roads. I remember passing this really beat up old 70s sedan with a creepy looking guy in the driver's seat driving past us in the other direction. This wasn't uncommon, as there were a lot of smaller, less economically sound towns scattered around the area, but for some reason, him and his car stood out, and my girlfriend and I definitely noticed it. About 200 meters further down the very windy road, there was a gravel pull-off area that overlooked the ocean. There was a camper van parked there, with a woman standing in front of it. As soon as she saw us, she jumped out onto the road and flagged us down. Now, I've read enough, and heard plenty of stories to know that pulling in to help a stranger on a quiet road might not be the safest idea, but I didn't give it much thought, since my friends were behind me as well. Luckily, she wasn't a dangerous person by any means. She was quiet, and seemed obviously upset and scared as we pulled in. I told my girlfriend to wait in the car, and I got out to speak to her. She was almost in tears. I can't remember where exactly she was from, but I remember that it was a Central European country, and she was touring around with her 4 or 5-year-old daughter. She told me her van had broken down, so she parked on the pull-off and called the van's company assistance line and was waiting for help. By this time, my friends had pulled in behind us, and a couple of them had come over to see what was up. Apparently, a creepy man had driven past her a few times already. The first time she encountered him, he pulled over and offered to take her and her daughter to the nearest town for help, but she thanked him and said no, telling him that she was waiting for the assistance vehicle. He left, but continued to keep driving past her every 10 to 15 minutes in opposite directions, slowing down, looking at them, then driving off. She begged us to stay with her while she waited for the assistance vehicle, because this guy terrified her and her daughter. I agreed, and my friends, being the awesome people they are, decided that me and my girlfriend could handle it and drove off. We stayed with the woman for a little while, before the same car my girlfriend and I had seen earlier slowly drove past. coming the opposite way we'd seen him the first time. As soon as he drove around the bend, the lady told us that it was the same guy. This got my girlfriend and I to take her much more seriously, especially after the feeling we got from just passing him on the road. A few minutes later, he came back from the other direction and pulled into the parking area. To give even more context, I'm not an intimidating man. I have almost zero muscle and a fairly soft complexion. So between me, a terrified foreign woman, her tiny daughter, and my girlfriend, we weren't in a good situation. Before we knew it, he came back again, but this time, he sat in his car and stared at us for a while before getting out. Now that we were seeing him up close, he definitely looked creepy as hell and definitely not friendly. He strolled over to us, and I started walking towards him to put myself between the girls and him. He looked at the girls first, and then me, and asked if he could help. I told him no, and that we were just waiting for the assistance vehicle, trying to make it obvious that we had everything covered. He then said that he could stay and wait with the woman and her daughter, so we wouldn't have to, but I told him we were happy to stay, and thanked him for the offer. He kinda just stood there for a while staring at all of us, not really saying anything, giving off mega creepy vibes. After what seemed like forever, another car drove past us and looked out, but kept going. This seemed to startle him. He mumbled, "Good luck," and got in his car and drove off. We waited with this terrified woman and her daughter for almost 90 minutes, and we ended up talking a lot, trying to explain that not everyone was like that in Australia. Finally, the assistance vehicle arrived, and a bigger dude who could definitely handle himself walked up. I guess I was still paranoid, so I asked him if I could see his ID and stuff to be safe, but he was in a car marked by the company, had a bunch of tools, and definitely seemed to be legit. We gave the lady my number and asked her to text me when she was back safe. She was so grateful for us staying with her for such a long time, and it made me feel good that even if this dude was just a weird-looking awkward country guy that didn't mean harm and was really just trying to help, we still made her feel more comfortable in a foreign country. After all was said and done, my girlfriend and I definitely believed that he was up to no good. I got a message from her later that night that she was safe, so everything ended well. I'm glad we were there at the right time, because if we hadn't been there, I know that something horrible would have happened to that woman and her daughter. So, I take my dad's ashes up to Glacier National Park every year. I lived in Colorado when this happened, and I was headed south through Idaho after I had visited Montana. My car broke down in Salmon, Idaho, and a nice man helped me out. I was headed through the mountains to Boise to visit a friend. It was about a 5-hour drive. Before I entered the truly mountainous section of Idaho, I saw a hot spring on the side of this 2-lane highway along the Salmon River, so I decided to take a dip to relieve some of my stress from the car issues earlier. The hot spring had a bathhouse up at the top near the road, and a wheelchair ramp that went down to the area near the springs on the side of the river. People had created little bath-shaped sections in the river that were separated by river stones, so you could actually sit in a spot that was shaped like a hot tub, because it held water from the hot springs while the river rushed over it. I was completely surrounded by huge mountains, and it was a really cool sight. I got out of my car and headed down to the hot spring, taking my dog with me. It was starting to get dark, but I wasn't planning on staying too long anyway. Every half hour, a car would pass by, so I was pretty much alone. Knowing that there wasn't anyone around, I took off my shirt and hopped in. When I was sitting in the hot spring, I noticed a car approaching in the distance. It pulled up right next to mine, directly in front of the bathhouse. It was a truck, and there were 3 men inside. Seamlessly, one man got out of the driver's side, and the 2 men got out of the passenger side. They moved without qualms, and they were all covered in heavy black gear. They looked like hunters. I couldn't see the expressions on their faces, since they were still a short distance away. The driver started heading down the wheelchair ramp towards me, with no hesitation, taking big and long strides. That's when I recognized that something seemed off. The 2 passengers from the other side of the car headed down the steep bank along the wheelchair ramp, taking a shortcut, so I was stuck in between both parties. Hastening, I hid and dressed myself underwater as my dog growled at them. I've only heard him growl all of twice in my life, and this was the second time. The driver kept on walking towards me, then stepped out onto the rocks in the river, continuously approaching me, even though he was covered in heavy gear that could get him waterlogged if he fell in. The other 2 passengers from the side of the car were also walking out on the rocks, directly in front of me. The driver got so close that I had to grab my dog before he lashed out at them. I was freaking out. The man was walking out onto the stones directly towards me. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and my clothes, then dragged my dog in between the two parties. My heart was in my ears at this point. However, the driver didn't stop. He turned around, very quickly making an arc, and was coming directly towards me again, still taking big strides, while the passengers continued approaching me as well. I was completely trapped in between them. On a whim, I ran up the bank, dragging my dog by his collar all the way into my car. The only way that I could get into my car without them grabbing me was by throwing my dog into the back and lunging myself into the passenger side door of my car. I threw my keys into the ignition and turned it on, right when the men were walking up between my car and their car. When I saw this, I hit the lock button on the door right away. Before anything else happened, or before I could even see their faces, I ended up throwing myself into the driver's seat, reversing my car, and hightailing it out of there. I drove for about 20 minutes down the road, until I crossed the river on a bridge and hid my car behind a bank near other campers. It was well hidden from the main road. The campers were looking at me, wondering what was going on, but I sat there and waited. Another 10 minutes passed by, and lo and behold, the same truck slowly drove by. They were definitely looking for me. I managed to wait another half an hour, and then drove up to the mountains, over to Boise, where I finally made it into safety. My wife and I are huge into traveling. We've been to 29 states together, and our goal one day is to reach all 50. Over the years, we've encountered our fair share of weirdos and run into a few sketchy areas, but what we encountered on our most recent trip easily takes the cake. In the early winter of 2021, my wife and I rented a cabin in Vermont near Mount Mansfield. Our goal was to hike there to take a few pictures of the scenery with the new camera I had just bought. The cabin we had booked was completely secluded, surrounded by woods and mountains, and we were really looking forward to going. Once we arrived to the cabin, I felt a sense of peace and connection with nature, making it such a unique trip that separated itself from all the others. The trees were lined white with snow, illuminating the woods to the point where you could see miles ahead while looking out the window at night. On our second day there, we woke up early and planned to hike up to Mount Mansfield. It was about 9 or 10 miles away from us, so we mapped out a route and made our way into the woods, with all the essentials we need for the day in our backpacks. We climbed up and down several small hills, occasionally crossing roads and a couple ravines, until we spotted something unusual. There was an old barn-type building in the distance. It sat alone in a field a few hundred feet ahead, and it definitely looked like it was abandoned. As we got closer, it was apparent that it caught on fire at some point, because the wood on the outside was badly burned. It was really creepy seeing it out there in the middle of nowhere, but it definitely sparked my interest. I started taking some close-up pictures of it, while my wife sat down on a barrel to eat and drink some water. I eventually sat down next to her to eat, since I was starting to get hungry too. We finished up pretty quickly, and got back on our feet shortly after so we wouldn't get too tired. Right when we were about to throw our backpacks on and leave, a loud metallic crash echoed from inside the barn. We both froze, immediately shifting our eyes towards the barn. From our vantage point, we had a clear view of the inside. It was mostly dark, but you could see the outlines of fences and some old tools along the walls. It definitely startled me, but I was convinced that either an icicle fell on something, the wind blew one of the tools over, or there was an animal inside. I took a few steps forward, while my wife stayed back, and I yelled, "Hello? Anyone in there?" I got no response, and I took a couple steps closer, where I was able to get a better look at everything inside. It definitely looked like animals lived in there at one point, because there were several cages and cells along the sides. I was able to crack a window for better lighting, and it made for a perfect picture. I asked my wife to bring my camera in so I could get a couple shots before we headed out. She handed me the camera, and just as I was about to take a picture, I almost jumped out of my skin when I heard a metallic scraping noise. It was coming from above us. We both looked up, confused and a little concerned. The barn had another floor above us, but it only covered maybe a quarter of its width. There weren't any ladders leaning up against the walls, and there wasn't even a staircase. My wife was pretty scared, but I'm usually very rational, so I rarely let myself get freaked out. I told her it had to be an animal, and there was nothing to worry about. Before my wife could even process what I said, I heard footsteps. And in that very moment, I knew that was not an animal. I put my finger up to my lip when my wife looked at me, because I could tell she was about to scream.
I yelled out something like, "Hey, who's up there?" But like before, I got no response. Suddenly, the face of an older-looking man emerged over the ledge above us. He had a long, gray, unkempt beard with dirt and mud all over his face. I waved at him, trying to act like I wasn't terrified that there was a random person above us in this seemingly abandoned barn. He looked at me for a split second before his eyes shifted to my wife, who was standing at the barn entrance, coaxing me to get out of there. At that point, I assumed he was homeless, so I tried to at least show some decency and asked if he needed help. After I said that, his head disappeared back over the ledge, and that's when I heard the same metallic scraping noise again from earlier. After a few seconds, it was clear that he didn't want any help, or any sort of interaction for that matter, so I started walking out. I was looking at my wife, who was obviously dumbfounded by this entire encounter. Suddenly, her eyes shifted up after being locked on mine. She screamed at me, "Get out!" Before I could even react, a pitchfork landed straight into the ground, just inches in front of me. The prong sunk deep into the ground, and I literally watched my life flash before my eyes. Out of instinct, I screamed as I frantically maneuvered around the pitchfork. Without looking back, we both ran as fast as we could in the direction of our cabin until we were a good distance away. I don't think the shock wore off until we were at least a mile away from that barn, because we didn't say a single word to each other the entire time. We eventually made it back to the cabin, still shaken up obviously. That was easily the most horrifying moment of our lives, especially mine, and I can't keep thinking about how I was literally inches away from death. Once I had some time to take in everything that happened, I started to put some things together, even though the intentions of that person and why they were there in the first place are still a mystery. Although I can't be sure, I think the metallic scraping sounds were him sharpening the pitchfork with something. It's at least the only explanation we could come up with. He most likely saw us coming from the window on the second level, but I don't understand why or how he got up, and why he literally tried to kill me. We were very lucky that day, and if it wasn't for my wife's warning to make me pause for a split second, that pitchfork would have directly hit me. I grew up on a farm just outside of Palm Beach County in Florida. My great-grandpa built the house, and it's been passed down to my family ever since. I've since moved out, but for reasons greater than wanting to just leave the family business. The farm is actually really successful, and at the time of this happening, my parents were talking with several major wholesale marketers and retailers. They'd occasionally go away for a few days to meet with them and discuss business plans, so I'd be asked to watch the house and take care of it when they'd be gone. On this particular trip, my parents would be leaving Tuesday morning and returning on Friday night. I didn't mind being on my own, and I actually kind of enjoyed the freedom it came with. My dad hired 2 workers years ago, Ronnie and Nick, so they'd be out there almost every day from sunrise to sundown. This made my life easier, and it significantly lowered the amount of other tasks I'd be expected to do without them. They were good friends of my dad, and our family as a whole completely trusted them, as they'd never once been a problem in the several years they worked there. They were more than welcome to come inside and use the bathroom, so I was used to them coming in and out at random times of the day. So, on the day my parents left, I was in charge of the house. I spent the first day working outside for a couple hours, then spent the majority of my time playing on my Xbox in the basement. The forecast was calling for severe thunderstorms that night, so I had to go outside and bring the chickens into the barn. Around 10:30, the storm had really started to pick up, so I went upstairs to get my shoes and poncho. While I was getting ready in the kitchen, I was able to see the tractor lights in the distance out by the crops. Ronnie's job was to come back and tarp the crops that were most vulnerable to the rain, so I wasn't too surprised to see him out there this late. I went outside, rounded up the chickens, and made my way back inside the house. I headed straight back down to the basement, where I got back on my Xbox. About a half hour later, I heard the tractor engine approaching the house, so I got up and ran out to the garage to say bye to Ronnie. However, once I got to the garage, the tractor was already parked there and the room was all locked up. Almost seconds later, I got a call from Ronnie. I had my phone in my hand, so I picked it up right away. "Hey, just a heads up. While I was out by the crops, I saw a person standing on the property line staring at me. Just make sure you lock the doors to the house. They walk back into the woods, but do it just to be safe." That was the last thing I ever could have expected to hear, but I complied and double-checked to make sure the doors were locked. I thanked Ronnie for the heads up and immediately called my dad. If I'm being honest, I was pretty creeped out. and although my dad couldn't do anything, I just felt safer being on the phone with him and letting him know. I knew very well that it could just be some kids messing around, but I was also unsettled, especially since Ronnie seemed to have left in such a hurry. After talking with my dad, I calmed down a bit, and he reminded me of the several guns I had access to in the house in the case of something happening. Our conversation brought me back to my senses, and I pretty much forgot about it afterwards. Just to err on the side of caution, I grabbed a pistol out of the safe and kept it by me for the rest of the night, just so I felt safer. I ended up heading back downstairs and played online with some of my friends for a couple more hours. By the time I was done playing, it was just after 1 a.m., and I was back upstairs getting ready for bed. Once I was in my room, I shut off the lights and laid down. As soon as the lights went off, I completely froze. A small beam of light was shining through my window curtain, and the only source of light that could reach my bedroom window was the barn. I looked out the window, and to my absolute shock, the barn doors were swung wide open and the place was fully lit up. I called my dad, absolutely terrified. Nobody should have been out there this late, and I was praying that he'd tell me that Ronnie or Nick stopped back over to take care of something. But when he picked up and I asked him, he was just as shocked as I was. He immediately told me to go down and see if their cars were in the driveway, and when I looked out, I felt my stomach sink. The driveway was empty. My dad told me he was going to call Ronnie and Nick just to confirm they weren't there, and told me to keep my phone by me for when he called back. He called me minutes later, telling me that he couldn't get through to Ronnie or Nick, so they were probably asleep. I hung up and called 911, while I locked myself in my room with the pistol. I stayed on the line with the operator until the police started banging on my front door. They spent hours searching our 200-acre property, but whoever was there before was now gone. Unfortunately, I was informed by the police that the chickens in the barn were all killed, and the entire barn looked like a slaughterhouse. Canine units searched the property for any sign of where the suspect may have gone, but the few footsteps they found were washed away in the rain and therefore untraceable. To add to the eeriness of it all, the window to our second garage furthest from the house was smashed, and wet footprints were found leading to the door that connected to the inside of the house. Toolboxes were moved around, rugs were flipped over, and the lock to the door had been tampered with. It was clear that this person was looking for a key to the house, and they very well may have had even more sinister intentions. Ronnie and Nick were thoroughly questioned by the police, but they each provided a reasonable alibi. My parents and I never had a feeling that they were the culprits, and they even continued working for my dad years after that, despite the possible danger. Ever since that night, I've never felt the same being inside that house. I moved out for college my freshman year, and I've never moved back in, nor do I ever plan on doing so. I've moved on with my life, but I still can't help but think about what else that person was planning to do, knowing that I easily would have been the next target had I not been aware. I'm originally from Iowa, born and raised, but have recently moved to Sarasota, Florida with my wife. I've always vacationed to Florida ever since I was a kid, so when I got an opportunity to relocate to Sarasota for work, my wife and I were thrilled. Now that we've lived here for the past 2 years, I've started to understand why Florida gets such a bad rap for having some strange people. My job allows me to work from home on certain days, so between my wife's hectic schedule as a registered nurse and mine, one of us is usually home. On a Wednesday night, I was at home working on my laptop in our screened-in patio, while my wife was working a double shift until 7 a.m. We live on a quiet street, tucked away from the main roads in the area. The houses are decently spread out, so there's about 50 to 60 feet between the properties. The overall area is fairly underdeveloped, and the majority of land behind the neighborhood houses are marshes. I'd say we have a pretty average-sized backyard, around 6,000 square feet. Behind that, there's little to no civilization for miles behind the marsh. So, around 8:30 p.m., as I was sitting out on the patio, I thought I heard a male voice screaming in the distance. It definitely caught my attention, so I stopped what I was doing and tried to make sense of where it was coming from. The screaming lasted maybe 5 seconds, but completely stopped and went silent afterwards. Although I couldn't be sure, it sounded like it was coming from the marsh, but who would be out there? I quickly forgot about it and finished up the rest of my work, then went inside to watch TV before bed. I remember sitting there on the couch when I heard the same scream from earlier again. I muted the TV, but this time, the screaming sounded to be much closer to the house. I got up to look out the back window, but it was too dark to see past my property line, so I forgot about it again and went back to the couch. 10 minutes passed, and out of nowhere again, I heard the same scream, but each time, it sounded like it was getting closer. This time, I actually decided to investigate, because unless the guy was screaming over a megaphone, it sounded like he was right outside my house. I flipped on the lights inside the screened-in patio and walked out to scan the backyard. As soon as I walked out, I could instantly make out a male figure standing in my backyard. I reacted by screaming at him to get away, and I threatened to call the cops. However, the figure showed no reply and just stood there completely motionless like a statue. So I did exactly what I said I'd do, and I walked back inside the house to grab my phone and call the cops. As soon as I shut the door behind me, he let out another scream at the top of his lungs, probably enough to destroy his vocal cords. Something really seemed to be wrong with him, so I started getting panicked. I told the dispatcher lady that someone needed to get over here as soon as possible, explaining that there was an unstable man screaming in my backyard. She told me to make sure that all doors and windows were locked, and instructed me to find something to defend myself with in the case of a break-in. I shut off all the lights in the kitchen, grabbed a knife from the drawer, and crouched my way to the window to see if he was still outside. Now that it was dark inside my house, I had a much better view of this man. He was only wearing his underwear and was completely covered in mud and grass. He was holding something in his hand, but I couldn't tell what it was, so I assumed it was a weapon of some sort. The dispatcher told me to lock myself in a safe room away from the windows, so I walked down the hall to my room and locked the door shut. I always thought that I'd remain calm if I were ever in a situation like this, but I was completely wrong. When you're living in the moment, knowing that your life could be on the line, I think a lot of people would be surprised at how terrifying it actually is. The lady told me that the police would be there within 10 minutes and to stay on the line no matter what. I did exactly that and sat up against the corner away from the windows while I waited for them to arrive. Suddenly, I began hearing a banging sound coming from the back of my house. My hand started sweating, and I gripped the knife even tighter in my hand as I listened in horror. It sounded like it was coming from the patio, and I froze as I realized that the banging sound was from him trying to break the door down to get inside. I told the dispatcher what was happening, and she told me to stay calm and quiet, reminding me that the police were only a few minutes away, but by the sounds of it, I didn't have a few minutes. This guy literally sounded like he was throwing his entire body against the door. Before I could even process what was happening, I heard a loud crash, followed by fast-paced footsteps loudly stomping inside the house. I reacted out of complete instinct. I jumped out the window and began running down the street as fast as I could, telling the dispatcher that he got in the house in between breaths. I didn't stop running until I saw a police car, and I flagged him down to stop. He immediately drew his gun on me, but I told him that I was the person who called, and I showed him the call with 911. The police arrived at the house, and I was eventually taken to the police station to talk with them. They ended up kicking down my front door, because as soon as they walked onto my property, they heard the same screams I was describing coming from inside my house. The man was found hiding behind my dresser in my bedroom with a machete, which meant that he kicked down my locked bedroom door. He was arrested and charged with several serious crimes, like aggravated burglary, possession of weapon during the commission of a crime, possession of methamphetamine, and attempted murder, just to name a few. He had no reason to attack me, and was found to be in a full-out state of drug-induced psychosis on the night this occurred. I know very well that I easily could have been killed that night, and I'm glad I made the decision to get out when I did, because otherwise, I would have been in a fight for my life. When I was in high school, I used to visit my dad every summer in Florida. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment, and my best friend, who I'll call Chloe, had moved into the same complex with her parents and little sister. My dad had to clean up the apartment that day, and he's pretty meticulous whenever he cleans, so he told me to go play with Chloe for a while. We decided to go swimming in the pool in the complex. Chloe's little sister just had a surgery a week prior, so she wasn't allowed to get her stitches wet, but she came along anyway. Chloe and I decided to invite another one of her friends that lived in the area at the time as well. Her father dropped her off at the pool, and we began swimming, while Chloe's little sister played on her phone. After hanging out there for a while, her little sister and I had to go to the bathroom, and the pool bathrooms were closing soon, I had warned Chloe to go before they closed them, but she waited too long, so by the time she got up to go, they were closed for the night. Since my apartment was the closest, she opted to go there, but my dad was still cleaning, and he didn't want anyone coming in, so she had to walk all the way over to the other side of the complex to use the bathroom in her house. Shortly after she left, an older couple decided to come to the pool and got in the jacuzzi behind us as we played. It was taking an unusually long time for Chloe to come back, and I started getting worried. I told Chloe's little sister and my friend to stay there, and I went to go look for her. Finally, I found Chloe walking back to the pool, wrapped in her towel, but behind her, I saw two men walking in our direction. We began walking together, but it took a good 10 minutes for us to get back to the pool, and not once did their path differ from ours. I got a really bad feeling in the pit of my stomach, and we decided to pick up the pace on the way back to the pool. We got there before the men did, and I told Chloe's little sister to gather our things and go to the other side of the pool near the older couple. The rest of us jumped in the pool and swam to the deep end to get a better distance away from them. Not long after, the men walked up to the pool. They kept looking at the older couple and then us, as if they were weighing their options. They kept whispering back and forth to each other, all while continuously looking at us. Thankfully, after a tense minute, they decided to leave. I was freaked out, so I called my dad right away. The older couple next to us asked if we were okay, then asked if we had known the men, and we said no. Our parents were furious upon hearing this, and came straight down to the pool. The police were called, and the older couple waited for our parents to arrive. When the police finally came, we gave them a description of the two men. They searched the entire complex, but they couldn't find a trace of them. The police took our statements and then left, so everyone had to basically go back home. Since everyone's parents were so freaked out, no one was allowed to leave their house unattended by their parents for the rest of the summer. I never really thought about the incident after that summer, until I was a junior in high school. When I turned on the TV one night after school to watch the news, the men's faces were on the screen. They were arrested in Miami for being smugglers into a sex trafficking ring. My face grew white as I called Chloe. She saw their faces on TV shortly after and started to cry as she realized it was the same men who had stalked us, not even 2 years prior. A month later, I got a call from my dad saying that some police officers would like to talk to me, but I was already heading down there for the next summer anyway, in a couple of days. When I got to Florida, I found out that Chloe, her little sister, and my other friend had already been talked to by the police. I found out that there had been other reports around the same time that our event happened. About 17 other girls had been stalked in our area by the same two men, and they ended up using our statements in court to put them in jail. I'm just glad that my gut had the right feeling about those guys. If there's one lesson I took out of this, it's to always trust your gut if you feel something is wrong.